The War of 1812 did not begin with one insult, one battle, or one speech in Congress. It began in the shadow of a much larger war. Across the Atlantic, Britain and Napoleonic France were locked in a struggle that seemed to pull the whole world into its gravity. Their armies fought in Europe, their fleets hunted one another at sea, and their governments tried to choke each other's trade. The United States was young, ambitious, and officially neutral, but neutrality was easier to declare than to defend. American merchants wanted to trade with both sides. American sailors wanted work, American shipowners wanted profits. But Britain, fighting for survival against Napoleon, believed the oceans were a battlefield. The Royal Navy needed sailors, and it did not always care whether a man standing on an American deck claimed American citizenship. British warships stopped American vessels, searched them, and took men they claimed were British deserters. To Americans, this was not only a policy, it was humiliation. The word that carried the anger was impressment. Men were seized from ships and forced into British naval service. Some really had been born British. Others insisted they were Americans. At sea, far from courts and newspapers, that distinction could be ignored by officers with guns, orders, and a desperate need for manpower. Every story of a sailor dragged from an American vessel became proof that the Republic's independence was unfinished. Trade restrictions deepened the crisis. Britain and France each tried to control neutral commerce. American ships were trapped between rival empires, seized by one power for trading with the other, and then punished again for trying to avoid both. President Thomas Jefferson tried economic pressure through the Embargo Act of 1807, hoping to force respect without war. Instead, the embargo damaged American merchants, angered coastal communities, and revealed how difficult it was for a weak naval power to defend neutral rights against empires. Then came the Chesapeake Leopard affair. In 1807, the British warship HMS Leopard attacked the American frigate USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia after the Chesapeake refused a search for deserters. American sailors were killed and wounded. Others were taken. The outrage was immediate. The attack felt like a reminder that Britain still treated the United States as a subordinate, not an equal nation. Yet even that did not bring war right away. Many Americans feared war with Britain would be disastrous. New England merchants depended on Atlantic trade and often opposed escalation. Federalists warned that a war would wreck commerce and strengthen the political power of the South and West. Republicans argued that honor and sovereignty were at stake. The argument over war became an argument over what kind of nation the United States intended to be. But the ocean was only half the story. While sailors were being seized at sea, settlers were pushing west across the Appalachians. The young republic was expanding into lands already occupied, defended, farmed, hunted, traded across, and remembered by native nations. To people in Washington and Kentucky, the frontier could look like future farms and future states. To native communities, it looked like a relentless pressure that treaties had failed to stop. That is why the road to 1812 runs in two directions at once. Across the Atlantic, where Britain challenged American sovereignty on the sea, and into the interior, where native leaders challenged American expansion on the land. The American Revolution ended British rule over the 13 colonies, but it did not settle the future of the interior. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 gave the United States claims to land east of the Mississippi, but many native nations had not consented to that transfer. They had their own homelands, alliances, histories, and diplomatic relationships. To them, Britain could not simply hand over land it did not truly control. The new American Republic therefore inherited not empty territory, but a contested world. In the Northwest Territory, native resistance remained powerful after the Revolution. The Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Ottawa, and other peoples understood that American settlement was not a passing problem. It was a system. Surveyors came first, then land offices, treaties, roads, forts, farms, courts, and militias. Once land entered that machinery, it rarely returned. The United States treated treaties as instruments of expansion. Officials negotiated with selected leaders, pressed for cessions, offered payments or goods, and then insisted that entire peoples were bound by documents many had never accepted. Native leaders often argued that land belonged not to one man or one village, but to a people, or even to all native peoples collectively. The American land system demanded signatures. Native sovereignty did not fit neatly into that paper world. The 1790s brought open conflict. American armies sent into the Northwest suffered severe defeats, including the destruction of forces under Josiah Harmar and Arthur St. Clair. St. Clair's defeat in 1791 was one of the worst disasters ever suffered by the United States Army. It shocked the Republic and proved that native military power in the region could not be dismissed. The United States responded by building a more disciplined force under Anthony Wayne. In 1794, Wayne defeated a native confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The following Treaty of Greenville in 1795 forced major land cessions in what became Ohio. American officials treated Greenville as a foundation for settlement. Many native people saw it as a forced compromise under pressure, not a final surrender of the future. Ohio statehood followed in 1803, and settlement accelerated. Roads widened, farms multiplied. Land speculators looked west. Military posts and territorial governments extended U.S. reach. Every new cabin could become a political fact. Every cleared field made reversal harder. For native communities, the crisis was not only military. Alcohol trade damaged families. Debt bound hunters to traders. Game declined as settlement spread. Young people saw old patterns disrupted. Leaders who tried accommodation were accused of surrendering too much. Leaders who resisted faced American military power. The question was not whether change would come. It was whether native nations could shape it, slow it, or survive it. In this world, spiritual renewal and political resistance became intertwined. The old diplomatic methods seemed unable to stop American expansion. Some leaders still sought negotiation, but others began looking for a broader answer. Unity across tribal lines, rejection of dependence on American goods, revival of traditional practices, and a common refusal to sell land piece by piece. That answer would soon gather around two Shawnee brothers. Tenskwatawa was not born as the prophet. He was a Shawnee man whose early life was marked by struggle, loss, and uncertainty. But around 1805, he experienced a spiritual transformation that changed his life and the politics of the frontier. He preached that native peoples had to reject destructive habits, abandon dependence on American goods, return to moral discipline, and resist the forces tearing their communities apart. His message spread because it spoke to pain many people already felt. Tenskwatawa's movement was religious, social, and political at the same time. He condemned alcohol. He warned against witchcraft. He called for purification and renewal. He said native peoples had lost strength by accepting the ways of the Americans. To followers, he offered a way to recover dignity and power in a world that seemed to be collapsing. His brother Tecumseh became the movement's most famous political and military voice. Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader of extraordinary force, eloquent, strategic, charismatic, and relentless. He understood that no single village could stop the United States alone. If land cessions continued one treaty at a time, American expansion would swallow the interior. His answer was a confederacy. Tecumseh argued that native land was held in common by native peoples and could not be sold by isolated leaders under pressure. This was the heart of his challenge to the United States. American officials depended on treaties with particular groups. Tecumseh attacked the legitimacy of that entire process. If the land belonged to all, then no one faction could sell it away. The brothers' movement drew people from multiple nations. Its center eventually emerged at Prophetstown, near the junction of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers in Indiana Territory. Prophetstown was more than a village. It was a symbol, a place where native unity might become real, where spiritual renewal supported political resistance, and where the future of the frontier might be contested before it was too late. American officials watched with alarm. To them, Prophetstown looked like a dangerous concentration of power. Settlers feared raids. Territorial leaders feared that the movement would halt land sales. Rumors spread that British agents in Canada were encouraging native resistance. The British did provide trade goods and maintained relationships with native nations around the Great Lakes. But American fear often blurred diplomacy, supply, and conspiracy into one accusation. William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, became Tecumseh's chief American opponent. Harrison was ambitious, disciplined, and deeply committed to opening land for settlement. He negotiated treaties that transferred millions of acres to the United States, including the controversial Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809. Tecumseh rejected that treaty as illegitimate. The conflict between Tecumseh and Harrison was not a personal quarrel, though it had personal drama. It was a clash between two visions of sovereignty. Harrison believed the United States could acquire land through treaties and then transform it into farms, towns, and states. Tecumseh believed that native peoples had to unite or be divided and dispossessed. Their confrontation would become one of the most important preludes to the War of 1812. While Prophetstown grew in the West, the United States remained divided over Britain. In Washington, President James Madison inherited the impossible problem of neutral rights. Britain continued practices Americans considered intolerable. France also interfered with American commerce, but Britain was the larger target because the Royal Navy dominated the seas and because memories of the Revolution still shaped American anger. Congress filled with younger voices from the South and West who believed the Republic had been insulted long enough. Later remembered as war hawks, men such as Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun argued that national honor, maritime rights, and frontier security required a stronger response. They believed Britain was encouraging native resistance, and many Westerners viewed the British presence in Canada as the hidden hand behind the violence they feared on the frontier. That belief was powerful because it connected two anxieties. Impressment made Britain the enemy at sea. Native resistance made Britain the suspected enemy on land. To Western settlers, the solution seemed obvious. Defeat Britain, invade Canada, and cut the link between British power and native resistance. Not all Americans agreed. New England Federalists saw the war movement as reckless. They feared economic ruin, naval weakness, and a land-hungry war that would benefit Western and Southern Republicans. Merchants who traded across the Atlantic were not eager for conflict with the world's strongest navy. Many Americans asked a practical question. If the United States could barely defend its coast, how would it defeat Britain? Madison moved cautiously, but the pressure mounted. Trade restrictions had failed to secure respect. Diplomacy had failed to end impressment. Frontier violence continued. British officials did not fully grasp how much American politics had changed. Many Americans felt trapped between humiliation and war. The frontier question made restraint harder. Settlers in Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and Tennessee demanded protection and land security. They saw Prophetstown as a threat. They believed native resistance could not be separated from British influence. The truth was more complex. Native leaders were not puppets. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa had their own goals, their own strategy, and their own reasons to resist. But in American politics, complexity often collapsed into accusation. The result was a dangerous spiral. American expansion increased native resistance. Native resistance increased American suspicion of Britain. Suspicion of Britain strengthened the War Party. The War Party promised that a strike against Canada could solve problems on both sea and frontier. In reality, war would not be so simple. Invading Canada would not automatically secure sailors' rights. Defeating Britain would not erase native sovereignty. But by 1811, the United States was moving toward decisions it could not easily reverse. Before Congress declared war, however, the frontier would explode at Tippecanoe. The Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809 became a breaking point. Harrison negotiated the cession of millions of acres in Indiana Territory from selected native leaders. To American officials, the treaty was legal. To Tecumseh, it was theft disguised as diplomacy. He argued that the land had not belonged to the signers alone and that the sale could not stand. He traveled widely, trying to build support for a united response. Tecumseh met Harrison face-to-face at Vincennes in 1810. The encounter was tense and unforgettable. Tecumseh insisted that the treaty was invalid. Harrison refused to abandon it. Each man stood for a different order. Around them, armed men watched, and the possibility of violence hung close. Tecumseh did not want a premature war on Harrison's terms. He needed time to strengthen the Confederacy and broaden alliances. He traveled south to seek support among the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and others. His dream was continental in scale. Native nations acting together before American expansion broke them apart. Harrison saw an opportunity in Tecumseh's absence. Prophetstown remained under Tenskwatawa's leadership, but Tecumseh was away. Harrison marched with a force of regulars and militia toward the village in 1811. He claimed he wanted to intimidate the movement and force compliance. To the people at Prophetstown, an armed American column approaching their home looked like a threat of destruction. The two sides camped near each other along the Tippecanoe. Negotiations were uncertain. Tension filled the night. Tenskwatawa's followers faced a terrible choice: wait and risk being surrounded, or strike first and trust the prophet's spiritual promises. Before dawn on November 7, 1811, native warriors attacked Harrison's camp. The fighting was chaotic and close. In the darkness, American soldiers struggled to form lines. Native fighters pressed hard, hoping to break the camp before daylight could stabilize the defense. Harrison's men eventually held. When the fighting ended, the native force withdrew. Harrison's army moved into Prophetstown and destroyed the village. The physical center of Tenskwatawa's movement was burned. To many Americans, Tippecanoe became a victory. Harrison's reputation rose. Years later, it would help carry him toward the presidency. But the battle did not destroy native resistance. It hardened it. Tecumseh returned to find Prophetstown ruined and his brother's authority damaged. The possibility of peace with Harrison's government became even more remote. Many native fighters now had stronger reasons to look toward the British when war came. Tippecanoe, therefore, did not end the frontier crisis. It made the coming War of 1812 more likely and more dangerous. After Tippecanoe, Americans argued over what the battle meant. Westerners said it proved that Prophetstown had been a military threat and that Britain was encouraging native resistance. Harrison's supporters presented the campaign as necessary defense. Critics asked whether Harrison had provoked the conflict by marching on the village while Tecumseh was away. Native communities understood the event through grief, anger, and the loss of a sacred and political center. The war party in Congress gained strength. If Britain was violating American rights at sea and encouraging native resistance in the interior, then war could be framed as a defense of sovereignty on both fronts. The logic was emotionally powerful even when the evidence was complicated. Madison still hesitated. War with Britain meant facing the Royal Navy. It meant exposing American ports. It meant relying on militias that might refuse to cross into Canada. It meant fighting a global empire while Britain was still at war with Napoleon. But the alternative seemed to many Republicans like national dishonor. By the spring of 1812, the crisis had reached its final stage. Congressional debates were bitter. Federalists warned against disaster. Warhawks insisted that delay only invited more humiliation. Westerners demanded security. Merchants feared ruin. Native nations watched events with their own calculations, knowing that an Anglo-American war might create opportunity or catastrophe. Tecumseh understood that British support could be essential. He had no illusion that Britain was purely benevolent. Native leaders had dealt with empires before, but if the United States was the immediate force taking land, then British Canada could become a strategic partner. The coming war would therefore be a war within a war. The United States against Britain and native confederacies fighting for survival against American expansion. On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Britain. The official causes centered on maritime rights, impressment, trade restrictions, and national sovereignty. But on the frontier, many people understood the war through land, fear, alliance, and resistance. The United States expected Canada might fall quickly. Many Americans believed British subjects there would welcome liberation, or at least offer weak resistance. That assumption would soon prove dangerous. Canada had militias, British regulars, loyalist memory, and native allies whose stakes were enormous. Tecumseh would become one of Britain's most important partners in the opening phase of the war. Harrison would remain central in the Northwest. The frontier that had burned before the declaration would now become one of the war's decisive theaters. When Congress declared war on June 18, 1812, the decision sounded clean on paper. The United States had listed its grievances: impressment, British restrictions on trade, violations of neutral rights. The belief, especially powerful in the West, that British Canada had become the shield and supply source behind native resistance. In Washington, those causes could be arranged into speeches and messages. On the frontier, the declaration arrived as a rumor carried by riders, a warning shouted across settlements, a new uncertainty moving through villages, forts, and council fires. The war began with confidence in some American circles and deep anxiety in others. War hawks had spoken as though British Canada might fall quickly. They imagined that many Canadians were barely attached to the empire and that a determined American invasion might bring them over, or at least sweep aside weak resistance. Thomas Jefferson famously suggested that acquiring Canada would be a matter of marching. That phrase captured a dangerous optimism. It made conquest sound like geography, not war. The United States did have advantages. It had population, ambition, and proximity. Canada was thinly defended compared with the United States. Britain was still absorbed in the titanic struggle against Napoleon. If America struck quickly, some believed the northern provinces could be taken before Britain could react in force. But the assumptions were fragile. Canada had British regulars, Canadian militia, loyalist memory, difficult terrain, and commanders who understood that survival depended on speed. Most importantly, Britain had native allies and partners whose stakes were immediate. For Tecumseh and many native fighters, an American invasion of Canada was not a distant imperial contest. It was part of the same struggle for land and survival that had already burned through Prophetstown. The American plan called for pressure along several points: Detroit and the western frontier, Niagara, the St. Lawrence corridor, and other approaches into Canada. It looked sensible on a map. In practice, it required coordination among generals, governors, militia, supply officers, and political leaders who often disagreed. Many militia units were reluctant to cross into Canada. Some officers lacked experience. Supplies moved slowly. Messages traveled through distance, weather, and confusion. The first campaign would expose those weaknesses quickly. At the center of the opening disaster stood General William Hull. Hull was an aging Revolutionary War veteran and governor of Michigan Territory. In 1812, he was ordered to lead an army north from Ohio to Detroit and then into Canada. His task was enormous. He had to move men, wagons, animals, artillery, food, ammunition, and civilian hopes through difficult country toward a frontier post surrounded by danger. Hull did not command a machine. He commanded regulars, militia, anxious officers, exhausted men, and a region filled with uncertain loyalties. His supply line back to Ohio was vulnerable. Native warriors could threaten roads and communications. British forces across the river watched him. Civilians in Detroit feared what war might bring to their homes. In July 1812, Hull crossed from Detroit into Canada and issued a proclamation promising liberation from British tyranny. It was meant to sound bold. Instead, it revealed the distance between American confidence and local reality. Canadians did not rise in eager support. British and Canadian forces did not melt away. Native allies did not disappear. The invasion stalled almost as soon as it began. Hull's army occupied ground but did not convert movement into victory. Every day without a decisive blow gave his enemies time. Across the Canadian side of the frontier, Major General Isaac Brock moved with a very different energy. Brock was a British officer responsible for defending Upper Canada at a moment when the odds looked dangerous. He had limited regular troops, uncertain militia, and a long frontier. But Brock understood something essential. In the opening days of war, psychology could matter as much as numbers. If American confidence could be shaken early, Canada might survive long enough for Britain to send more strength. Brock also understood the importance of native alliance. Tecumseh and his confederacy were not accessories to British strategy. They were independent actors whose goals overlapped with British needs. Brock needed them because they could move, scout, intimidate, and fight across the frontier in ways British regulars could not. Tecumseh needed British military power because the United States was the expanding force pressing hardest against native homelands. When Brock and Tecumseh met, each recognized force in the other. Later memory would turn their relationship into legend, but the practical truth was already powerful. Brock brought imperial authority, speed, and command. Tecumseh brought regional knowledge, warriors, political vision, and the moral urgency of a people fighting for survival. Their cooperation transformed the campaign around Detroit. First came the capture of Fort Mackinac in July 1812. British forces and native allies took the island post before the American garrison even knew war had been declared. The loss shocked the frontier. Mackinac controlled influence across the upper Great Lakes and fur trade world. Its fall sent a signal. The war would not wait for American plans to unfold neatly. Hull received bad news from every direction. His supply line was threatened. Fort Mackinac had fallen. Native warriors were gathering. Canadian resistance was stronger than expected. His own militia grew uneasy. Officers questioned his caution. He had crossed into Canada with a proclamation. Now he began to fear being cut off. Tecumseh understood fear as a weapon. Native warriors moved through the woods, appeared and vanished, and magnified American uncertainty. Brock encouraged that effect. He and Tecumseh made their numbers seem larger and their position more dangerous than it was. They did not need to destroy Hull's army in open battle if they could convince Hull that destruction was inevitable. Hull withdrew back to Detroit. The retreat was more than a military movement. It was a collapse in confidence. The army that had been expected to invade Canada was now defending its own base. Brock moved fast. He crossed the Detroit River with British regulars, Canadian militia, artillery, and native allies. Tecumseh's warriors maneuvered in ways designed to be seen and feared. The message was clear. Detroit was surrounded by enemies who could not be easily counted, and a fight might expose soldiers and civilians alike to terrible consequences. Hull faced a decision under pressure. He worried about his supplies. He worried about native warfare. He worried about the civilians inside Detroit, including women and children. He worried that his militia might not stand. He worried, perhaps most of all, that he no longer understood the true strength against him. On August 16, 1812, Hull surrendered Detroit without a major battle. The shock was enormous. An American army, a key frontier post, weapons, supplies, and the hopes of the Western campaign had fallen into British hands. Brock became a hero in Canada. Tecumseh's stature rose even higher. The United States received the news with disbelief and anger. Hull would later be court-martialed and sentenced to death, though his sentence was remitted because of his Revolutionary War service. His name became attached to failure, but the disaster was larger than one man's fear. Detroit revealed that the United States had entered war with weak coordination, overconfident assumptions, fragile logistics, and deep ignorance of the alliance system forming against it. It also proved that Tecumseh's confederacy could change the fate of campaigns. The fall of Detroit was not the only blow on the western frontier. At Fort Dearborn, near the site of present-day Chicago, the small American garrison became trapped by distance and danger. The fort stood far from easy reinforcement. Once war began and British influence spread through the region, its position became nearly impossible. Orders came to evacuate. Evacuation did not mean safety. Soldiers, civilians, women, children, and Allied Miami escorts prepared to leave the fort and move through exposed country. Tension surrounded every decision. Goods were destroyed or distributed. Promises were made and doubted. People inside the fort knew that the world outside its walls had changed. On August 15, 1812, shortly after leaving Fort Dearborn, the evacuation column was attacked by Potawatomi warriors. The fighting became one of the most traumatic frontier episodes of the opening war. Many soldiers and civilians were killed, others were taken prisoner. The event entered American memory as a massacre, a word that hardened fear and anger across the frontier. To understand its effect, we have to see how stories traveled. News of Fort Dearborn moved through settlements already shaken by Detroit. Families imagined isolated cabins surrounded by enemies. Militia leaders demanded retaliation. Politicians used frontier suffering as proof that the war against Britain and the struggle against native resistance were inseparable. Native communities saw the war through a different history. American forts, roads, treaties, and settlements had already brought years of pressure. Violence did not begin in August 1812. It had grown from dispossession, failed diplomacy, raids, reprisals, and the collapse of trust. But in American newspapers and speeches, the frontier became a theater of horror where nuance rarely survived. This was one of the war's most dangerous patterns. Every attack confirmed American fears. Every American retaliation confirmed native fears. British officers tried to use native alliances while also worrying about how frontier violence would be perceived. Native leaders tried to fight for their own goals while being described by Americans as tools of Britain. Settlers wanted security, but security often meant more land, more forts, and more pressure on the people already resisting expansion. Fort Dearborn therefore mattered not only because of what happened on the ground. It mattered because it gave the war an emotional language. Detroit proved that American armies could fail. Fort Dearborn made the frontier feel exposed, personal, and terrifying. Together, they transformed the first months of war into a crisis of confidence. In the West, the War of 1812 was no longer a matter of speeches about sailors' rights. It was a war for forts, villages, roads, families, and the future of the Great Lakes interior. While the land war opened with humiliation, the sea delivered a surprise that Americans desperately needed. The Royal Navy was the most powerful naval force in the world. Britain ruled the Atlantic with ships, guns, discipline, and experience built through years of war against France. Few Americans expected the small United States Navy to defeat Britain in a broad naval contest. The American fleet was too small for that, but individual frigates could still fight, and in 1812, they did. On August 19, 1812, the USS Constitution met HMS Guerrière in the Atlantic. Constitution was a heavy American frigate, strongly built and well-handled. Guerrière was a British frigate with an aggressive crew and the confidence of a navy accustomed to victory. The battle became one of the great morale moments of the early war. Constitution's fire was devastating. Guerrière was battered, dismasted, and forced to surrender. American sailors watched British shot appear to bounce from Constitution's strong live oak hull, helping give the ship its famous nickname, Old Ironsides. The victory did not change control of the seas. Britain still had overwhelming naval power. British blockades would later tighten and damage American commerce badly. But morale matters in war, especially when a young nation is absorbing defeat. After Detroit, Americans needed proof that Britain could be beaten somewhere. Constitution gave them that proof. Naval victories also helped define the meaning of the war for many Americans. If impressment and maritime rights had been central causes, then success at sea carried symbolic weight. The sailors who fought aboard Constitution were not solving the frontier crisis, but they were answering humiliation with skill, discipline, and courage. More naval actions followed. The USS United States captured HMS Macedonian in October. The sloop Wasp defeated HMS Frolic before being captured by a larger British ship. These battles were small compared with the global scale of the Royal Navy, but in American newspapers, they became enormous. They told citizens that the Republic's sailors could stand against the empire that had been seizing men from American decks. Britain was irritated and embarrassed by these defeats, but not strategically broken. The Royal Navy adapted. More ships, tighter blockades, and greater caution would follow. Still, in 1812, the American Navy gave the country something the Army had failed to provide: early victories clean enough to celebrate. The contrast was striking. On land, invasion had become surrender. On the lakes and frontier, native and British cooperation had overturned American plans. At sea, American frigates won duels that turned into legends. The war was already refusing to become one simple story. After Detroit, American leaders still hoped to salvage the campaign by striking along the Niagara frontier. The Niagara River separated New York from Upper Canada. Across that water lay roads, villages, heights, and military posts that seemed within reach. If American forces could cross successfully, perhaps they could regain momentum, threaten British Canada, and prove that Detroit had been an exception rather than a warning. Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a New York militia officer with little battlefield experience, commanded American forces in the region. His army included regulars and militia, but the distinction mattered. Militia laws and beliefs about defensive service meant that some men resisted crossing into Canada. To them, defending American soil was one thing, invading British territory was another. This problem went to the heart of the American war effort. The United States had declared war and planned invasion, but parts of its military system were not built for offensive operations across a border. political support for war did not automatically become battlefield cohesion. On October 13, 1812, American troops crossed the Niagara River and attacked Queenston Heights. The operation began with danger and confusion. Boats, currents, darkness, command problems, and the difficulty of moving men under fire. Yet American forces managed to gain a foothold and climb the heights. Isaac Brock responded with characteristic speed. The hero of Detroit rode toward the crisis and led a counterattack. In the fighting, Brock was killed. His death shook British Canada deeply. He had become the symbol of bold defense, and now, only weeks after Detroit, he was gone. But Brock's death did not give the Americans victory. British regulars, Canadian militia, and native allies under leaders including John Norton continued the fight. American forces on the heights needed reinforcement. Many militia on the American side refused to cross the river. Men who had fought their way into Canada found themselves isolated. By the end of the battle, the American position collapsed. Hundreds were captured. Queenston Heights became another failed invasion, another lesson in the difference between ambition and execution. The consequences were severe. The United States had now suffered major failure in the West and on the Niagara frontier. Brock was dead, but Canada had survived. American confidence in easy conquest had been shattered. British and Canadian morale strengthened around the idea that invasion could be defeated. For Tecumseh and native allies, the opening months had shown that American expansion could be checked when British power and native resistance worked together. For American Westerners, that same fact made the war feel even more urgent. The conflict was becoming a cycle. American failures strengthened native British cooperation, and that cooperation intensified American determination to break it. By the end of 1812, the war looked nothing like the confident predictions that had preceded it. Canada had not fallen. Detroit had surrendered. Fort Dearborn had become a frontier trauma. Queenston Heights had ended in another American defeat. Militia problems, poor coordination, weak logistics, and inexperienced command had all been exposed. The United States had discovered that declaring war was easier than conducting it. Yet the year was not simply a story of American failure. At sea, Constitution, United States, and WASP had given Americans victories that mattered enormously to morale. They proved that American sailors could fight with professionalism and courage. They gave the public heroes, headlines, and symbols at a moment when the land campaigns offered mostly embarrassment. Britain and Canada had also learned lessons. Canada could be defended, but not casually. The frontier depended on alliances, speed, and local knowledge. Brock's death removed a gifted commander. Native allies remained essential, but British leaders had to manage both military need and political anxiety over frontier warfare. The war in North America was still secondary to Britain's struggle against Napoleon, but it could not be ignored. Native nations faced the most profound stakes. Tecumseh's alliance with the British had helped produce one of the greatest early victories of the war at Detroit. For a moment, the possibility of halting American expansion seemed more real than it had in years. But that possibility depended on continued British commitment, native unity, and battlefield success across a vast region. None of those could be guaranteed. The United States entered 1813 angry, embarrassed, and determined to recover. The Northwest would become the focus of a new campaign under William Henry Harrison. Control of the Great Lakes would become essential. Naval construction on inland waters would matter as much as speeches in Washington. The war would move toward Lake Erie, the Thames, and the fate of Tecumseh's confederacy. Episode 1 began with sailors dragged from ships and native land threatened by expansion. It ends with the first year of war, proving that those two crises had merged into one conflict. The sea gave America its pride back. The frontier took it away again. Detroit elevated Tecumseh and Brock. Queenston Heights killed Brock but saved Canada. Fort Dearborn deepened fear. Old Ironsides became a national legend. The War of 1812 was no quick march into Canada. It was a hard lesson in power, geography, sovereignty, and survival. And as 1813 approached, the war's center of gravity began to shift toward the Great Lakes, where ships built in forests and armies moving through mud would decide the future of the Northwest. At the end of 1812, the United States had learned a brutal lesson. The war it expected to win quickly had not bent to American confidence. Detroit had fallen. Fort Dearborn had become a frontier trauma. Queenston Heights had ended in defeat. Canada had not collapsed. Tecumseh's alliance with the British had helped transform the Western War into something far more dangerous than many Americans had imagined. Yet defeat did not end American ambition. It sharpened it. In Washington, President James Madison's administration understood that the first year could not become the pattern for the entire war. The Republic needed proof that it could recover. In Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and the Territories, the call for revenge mixed with the practical need to regain lost ground. Detroit had to be retaken, the Great Lakes had to be controlled, the frontier had to be secured. Canada still tempted American planners, even after a year of failed invasions. The next phase of the war would be fought across water, forests, mud roads, forts, and native homelands. It would not be decided by one battlefield. It would be decided by whether armies could be supplied, whether fleets could be built from raw timber, whether militia could be held together, and whether native coalitions could survive the pressure of American recovery. The British and their allies also knew the stakes. Upper Canada had survived the first year, but survival did not equal safety. Isaac Brock was dead. British manpower remained limited. The Royal Navy ruled the Atlantic, but inland lakes were a different problem. On the Great Lakes, control had to be built locally, ship by ship, cannon by cannon, sailor by sailor. For Tecumseh, the meaning of 1813 was even sharper. Detroit had given his confederacy momentum, but if the British could not hold the Lake Corridor and the Detroit frontier, the native barrier he hoped to build could begin to collapse. His alliance with Britain was powerful, but it also made his future depend on British commitment and British success. Far to the south, another crisis was gathering inside the Creek world. Tecumseh's message of resistance had traveled through the southeast before the war. But the Creek nation was not united behind one path. Some leaders worked with the United States. Others, remembered as Red Sticks, resisted American expansion, accommodation, and internal opponents. The result would become a civil war within the Creek world and a frontier war that drew in Andrew Jackson, U.S. militia, Cherokee allies, Choctaw allies, and terrified settlers. So Episode 2 begins with a nation trying to recover from humiliation, an empire trying to defend Canada, native leaders trying to preserve sovereignty, and two theaters of war beginning to connect: the Great Lakes and the southern frontier. In 1813, the war caught fire. The American recovery in the Northwest centered on William Henry Harrison. Harrison already knew the frontier war. As governor of Indiana Territory, he had negotiated land cessions, confronted Tecumseh, marched on Prophetstown, and fought at Tippecanoe. To many Western Americans, he was the natural leader to repair the disaster of Detroit. To many native people, he was one of the faces of the expansion they were fighting to stop. Harrison's new task was punishingly practical. He had to build an army in country that resisted armies. Roads were poor or non-existent. Wagons sank in mud, rivers froze, flooded, or blocked movement. Men enlisted and went home. Supplies disappeared into distance, horses died, food spoiled. Disease moved faster than orders. The Northwest Campaign was therefore not only a story of battles, it was a story of logistics. Detroit could not be recovered by anger alone. Harrison needed roads, depots, fortified posts, boats, pack animals, discipline, and time. Every mile toward the enemy required labor before glory. In January 1813, a forward American force under James Winchester moved toward the River Raisin near Frenchtown in Michigan Territory. The movement was meant to support the recovery of Detroit, but it exposed the Americans before Harrison's larger system was ready. British forces and native warriors under Henry Proctor and native allies struck. The fighting at the River Raisin ended in American defeat. The aftermath became one of the war's most searing memories in Kentucky. Wounded prisoners were killed by some native warriors after the battle, despite attempts by others to restrain violence. News of the event traveled under the cry, "Remember the Raisin." That slogan mattered. It turned grief into fuel. In Kentucky, where many of the dead had come from, the River Raisin became a rallying wound. It deepened the emotional link between the war against Britain and the war against native resistance. It also hardened the desire for revenge, which would shape the campaign that followed. Harrison pulled his forces back into a defensive system and built Fort Meigs on the Maumee River in present-day Ohio. The fort was not glamorous. It was a large, muddy, timbered work meant to hold supplies, protect the line of advance, and anchor the American recovery. But in frontier war, such places mattered more than speeches. Proctor and Tecumseh came against Fort Meigs in the spring of 1813. British artillery opened fire. Native warriors surrounded the area. Inside the fort, Harrison's men endured bombardment, mud, fear, and confusion. Relief forces from Kentucky arrived, but part of that force made a disastrous attack on British batteries and was overwhelmed. Fort Meigs became a brutal lesson in discipline. Some Americans fought well, others rushed too far, too fast, and paid for it. The siege did not break Harrison's position, but it did show that Tecumseh and Proctor could still threaten the American line. For Tecumseh, Fort Meigs was also a political test. He needed British pressure to remain strong, but he was frustrated by what he saw as British caution. Tecumseh wanted decisive action. He knew that time favored the United States. Every month gave Americans another road, another fort, another ship, another wave of militia. A second attack came later at Fort Stephenson, where a young American officer, George Croghan, refused to abandon the post. British and native forces attacked, but the fort held. The defense became another boost to American morale. After Detroit and the River Raisin, Western Americans were desperate for proof that their forts could stand. By mid-1813, Harrison had not yet retaken Detroit, but he had done something essential. He had stopped the collapse. He had created a line from which recovery could begin. What he still needed was control of Lake Erie. Without the lake, supplies and armies moved slowly and dangerously. With the lake, Detroit could be approached, British positions could be isolated, and the Western War could turn. That meant the next decisive battlefield would not be a field at all. It would be water. While Harrison struggled in the Northwest, American leaders also looked toward Lake Ontario and the Niagara frontier. The logic was simple. If the United States could control Lake Ontario, threaten the St. Lawrence, and pressure Upper Canada from the east, British defense would become much harder. But as in 1812, simple maps produced complicated campaigns. In April 1813, American forces under Henry Dearborn and Naval Commander Isaac Chauncey attacked York, the capital of Upper Canada, present-day Toronto. York was not the strongest British military position, but it carried political value. Capturing it would show that the United States could strike into Canada after the failures of the first year. The landing succeeded. American troops pushed inland. British and Canadian defenders resisted, but could not hold the town. During the fighting, a powder magazine exploded, killing and wounding many Americans, including Brigadier General Zebulon Pike. Pike had been a prominent officer and explorer. His death gave the victory a bitter edge. York fell, but occupation turned ugly. Public buildings were burned, property was taken, and the episode left a memory in British Canada that would matter later. The Americans had won a raid, but they had not captured the heart of British power. They had not secured Queenston, the more important naval base. They had gained a symbolic victory while missing a strategic opportunity. The war on Lake Ontario became a contest of ships, ports, and caution. Chauncey and his British counterpart, James Yeo, maneuvered for advantage, but neither side easily destroyed the other. Control of the lake shifted in rhythm with shipbuilding, weather, and risk. A fleet that looked dominant in 1 month could become vulnerable when the enemy launched a new vessel. At the Niagara frontier, the United States followed York with an attack on Fort George in May 1813. This time, the operation showed better coordination between Army and Navy. American troops landed under fire, British forces withdrew. Fort George fell, and for a moment it looked as though the American campaign might finally break into Upper Canada. But again, victory did not become decision. American forces advanced inland and collided with the limits that had haunted them before. Command confusion, supply problems, local resistance, and British counteraction. In June at Stony Creek, a British night attack threw the Americans into confusion. The battle was small, but its effect was large. 2 American generals were captured. The advance stalled. The momentum from Fort George faded. Later that month, at Beaver Dams, another American force moved against a British outpost and fell into disaster. Laura Secord, a Canadian civilian, famously warned British forces of the approaching Americans. Native warriors, including Mohawk and Caughnawaga fighters, played a crucial role in surrounding and pressuring the American column. The Americans surrendered. Beaver Dams showed again that Native allies were not side notes in the war. Their presence, movement, and battlefield skill could decide outcomes. It also strengthened Canadian memory of resistance. Civilians, militia, British regulars, and Native allies all contributing to defense against invasion. For the United States, the Niagara campaign became another frustration. Fort George had fallen, but the larger invasion faltered. York had been burned, but British Canada survived. Lake Ontario remained contested. The war seemed to offer victories that dissolved before they became strategic success. Still, the pressure mattered. Britain had to defend multiple fronts. American forces were learning, even through failure. And inland on another lake, Oliver Hazard Perry was preparing the campaign that would change the Western War. Lake Erie was the hinge of the Northwest. Whoever controlled it could move men and supplies across water far faster than overland roads allowed. British control helped sustain Detroit and Proctor's position. American control could cut that lifeline, open the way for Harrison, and force the British and Tecumseh to retreat. But control of Lake Erie had to be built almost from nothing. At Presque Isle, Erie, Pennsylvania, American shipwrights worked under enormous pressure. Trees became frames, frames became hulls. Hulls became brigs and schooners. Cannons had to be dragged into place. Sailors had to be found. Supplies had to pass through weak infrastructure. British ships watched and threatened from the lake. Oliver Hazard Perry was young, intense, and determined. He had served at sea, but Lake Erie was not the Atlantic. It was shallow in places, difficult to enter, and strategically unforgiving. Perry needed ships, crews, guns, and a chance to get his vessels over the sandbar at Presque Isle before the British could destroy them. His squadron became a product of improvisation and urgency. The brigs Lawrence and Niagara would be central. Perry named Lawrence in honor of Captain James Lawrence, who had died after the fight between USS Chesapeake and HMS Shannon. Lawrence's dying words, remembered as "Don't give up the ship," became Perry's battle flag. The phrase was not just decoration, it was an instruction for a war that had already tested American endurance. British commander Robert Heriot Barclay faced his own difficulties. His squadron suffered from shortages, manpower problems, and supply strain. The British position at Amherstburg depended on the lake. If Barclay could keep control, Proctor and Tecumseh could continue to hold the Detroit frontier. If he lost, everything behind him would begin to shake. On September 10, 1813, the two squadrons met near Put-in Bay. The Battle of Lake Erie began with wind, distance, and positioning. Perry's flagship Lawrence took heavy punishment. British fire tore into her. Men fell. Guns were disabled. The ship became a wreck of splintered wood, smoke, blood, and command pressure. For a time, the battle seemed to be slipping away. Perry refused to let it end there. With Lawrence shattered, he transferred by small boat through enemy fire to Niagara. The image became legendary, a commander crossing open water under danger, carrying the battle's hope from a dying ship to one still capable of action. Once aboard Niagara, Perry drove into the British line and turned the fight. By the end, the entire British squadron had surrendered. Perry sent Harrison the message that entered American memory: "We have met the enemy and they are ours." It was brief, almost spare, but it carried the weight of a year of humiliation. Detroit could now be answered. The lake was American. The road back into Michigan was open. The victory mattered beyond morale. It broke the British supply position in the West. Proctor and Tecumseh could not remain where they were without control of the lake. Amherstburg and Detroit became vulnerable. The alliance that had seemed so powerful in 1812 now faced a hard truth. Ships built in Pennsylvania had changed the land war. For Harrison, Perry's victory was the signal to move. For Tecumseh, it was the beginning of a crisis. After Lake Erie, the British position in the Detroit frontier unraveled. Proctor abandoned Detroit and Amherstburg and retreated eastward into Upper Canada. Tecumseh was furious. To him, retreat threatened everything. Native families and warriors had committed themselves to the alliance with Britain because they believed it might halt American expansion. If British commanders abandoned ground whenever pressure mounted, what would become of the native barrier? Tecumseh reportedly demanded that Proctor stand and fight. His argument was strategic and moral. The land was not an abstraction. It was home, hunting ground, diplomatic space, and future. Retreat meant exposing native communities to American return. It meant that the victory at Detroit might become a memory instead of a foundation. Harrison pursued with American forces, supported by Perry's control of Lake Erie. The campaign moved through roads, rivers, and settlements shaped by exhaustion. British regulars, Canadian militia, native warriors, and families moved under pressure. Supplies were short, confidence weakened. On October 5, 1813, the retreat ended near the Thames River at Moraviantown. The battle was swift and decisive. Harrison's mounted Kentucky troops charged. British resistance broke quickly. Proctor's line collapsed, and he fled. Tecumseh and his warriors continued fighting in the wooded ground. There, Tecumseh was killed. His death changed the war. It did not end native resistance, and it did not erase the many native leaders and communities still fighting for their own futures. But Tecumseh had been the most visible architect of a broad confederacy against American expansion in the Old Northwest. He had offered a political vision larger than one village or one treaty. He had argued that native land could not be sold piece by piece. That division was the path to dispossession, and that unity was the only possible answer to the scale of American pressure. At the Thames, that vision suffered a terrible blow. American memory turned the battle into revenge for Detroit and the River Raisin. Harrison's reputation soared. Kentucky fighters found the vindication they had wanted. The Northwest frontier seemed redeemed. Detroit was back in American hands. British power in the region had been badly damaged, but triumph had a darker meaning. With Tecumseh dead and British forces pushed back, the possibility of a British-supported native buffer state in the Old Northwest weakened dramatically. The United States had not simply won a battle. It had removed one of the greatest obstacles to future expansion. Proctor's conduct damaged British trust with native allies. Many native people had already suspected that British promises were limited by British priorities. The Thames deepened that suspicion. Britain needed native allies, but the Empire's central war was still against Napoleon. Native survival was not the same as British strategy. Harrison became a national figure. Perry became a hero. Tecumseh became a legend, admired even by enemies for courage, eloquence, and vision. But legends do not restore armies. They do not rebuild confederacies by themselves. The Western War had turned. Yet even as Tecumseh fell in the north, the southern frontier was exploding into violence of its own. The Creek War cannot be understood as a simple footnote to the War of 1812. It was connected to the larger war, but it was also its own crisis. A civil conflict within the Creek Nation, a struggle over accommodation and resistance, a frontier war involving the United States, and a devastating chapter in the history of native sovereignty in the Southeast. Creek society was diverse and politically complex. Towns did not always move together. Some leaders worked to maintain relations with U.S. officials. Others believed accommodation had become surrender by another name. Trade, debt, land pressure, roads, missionary influence, and American demands all created internal strain. Tecumseh had traveled south before the war, urging resistance and unity. His message did not create every division, but it added force to existing tensions. Among those who resisted accommodation, the Red Sticks emerged as a militant movement, committed to defending Creek autonomy and restoring older ways of life. Their opponents included other Creeks who feared that militant resistance would bring disaster. The conflict escalated in 1813. At Burnt Corn Creek in July, Mississippi Territory militia attacked a Red Stick party returning from Pensacola, where they had obtained supplies. The fighting was confused and inconclusive, but its effect was explosive. Retaliation became more likely. Fear spread among settlers and among Creeks aligned against the Red Sticks. Fort Mims became the center of that fear. The fort, located north of Mobile, held settlers, militia, enslaved people, and mixed Creek families who had taken shelter behind its stockade. Warnings came that danger was near, but preparation was incomplete. On August 30th, 1813, Red Stick warriors attacked. The assault was catastrophic. Hundreds inside the fort were killed. Some were taken captive. The event shocked the region and became one of the most powerful rallying cries of the southern frontier. Like the River Raisin in Kentucky, Fort Mims became a wound turned into policy. But the story was not only settler fear. Fort Mims also showed the depth of division inside Creek society. Many victims had Creek ties. The violence fell inside a world of kinship, faction, and civil conflict, as well as along the line between Native and American communities. The United States responded with overwhelming force. State militias mobilized. Tennessee sent Andrew Jackson. Georgia and Mississippi Territory forces moved. Cherokee and Choctaw warriors allied with the United States, in part because their own interests and rivalries led them against the Red Sticks. Creek opponents of the Red Sticks also joined the campaign. Andrew Jackson was not yet the national hero of New Orleans. In 1813, he was a hard-driving militia commander dealing with supply shortages, mutiny threats, hunger, political disputes, and a war that stretched his fragile army. He could be relentless with enemies and with his own men. He believed discipline had to be forced if necessary. Jackson's campaign moved through the Creek country with violence and hardship. At Tallushatchee in November 1813, American forces under John Coffee destroyed a Red Stick town. At Talladega, Jackson relieved friendly Creeks besieged by Red Sticks. These battles were part of a widening war in which villages, food supplies, alliances, and terror all mattered. The Southern War became a mirror of the Northern one in several ways. Native resistance was divided by internal politics. The United States used Native allies against Native opponents. American victory would open more land. Frontier trauma gave political energy to campaigns of retaliation. By early 1814, the Red Sticks had fallen back toward a fortified bend in the Tallapoosa River. The place was called Tohopeka by the Creeks. Americans would remember it as Horseshoe Bend. Horseshoe Bend was a natural fortress. The Tallapoosa River curved around the land in a great loop, creating a peninsula protected on three sides by water. Across the narrow neck of land, the Red Sticks built a strong barricade of logs. Behind it were warriors, families, and the desperate hope that this position could stop Jackson's advance. Menawa, one of the Red Stick leaders, prepared to resist. The defenders knew the stakes. Defeat would mean more than losing a camp. It could mean the breaking of the Red Stick military movement and the reshaping of the Creek world under American power. Jackson approached with U.S. regulars, Tennessee militia, and Native allies including Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek fighters opposed to the Red Sticks. His army had suffered shortages and discipline problems, but by March 1814, he had enough force to strike. On March 27, 1814, Jackson attacked. Artillery fired into the barricade, but did not simply erase it. American troops eventually stormed the works in a direct assault. Meanwhile, Cherokee and other Native allies crossed the river, attacked from the rear, and set fire to parts of the Red Stick village. The defenders were trapped between the barricade and the river. The battle was devastating. Red Stick casualties were enormous. Menawa survived, badly wounded, but the military power concentrated at Horseshoe Bend was broken. American losses were far smaller, though still real. Among the wounded was a young Sam Houston, fighting under Jackson, long before his own later fame in Texas. Horseshoe Bend effectively ended the main Creek War. But victory did not bring justice. In August 1814, the Treaty of Fort Jackson forced the Creeks to cede an immense amount of land, including land from Creek groups that had fought alongside the United States. Jackson demanded land as security, punishment, and strategic prize. The result opened much of present-day Alabama and parts of Georgia to American expansion. This is why Horseshoe Bend belongs inside the larger story of the War of 1812 and the Indian Wars. It was not just a battle against one faction, it became a turning point in the transfer of land and power in the Southeast. The pattern was familiar. Native allies helped the United States defeat Native enemies, only to find that American expansion did not stop at the line between friend and foe. The logic of security became the logic of dispossession. Jackson emerged from the campaign with a reputation for resolve. That reputation would carry him toward command at New Orleans and eventually toward the presidency. But for the Creek people, the cost was catastrophic. Towns were destroyed. Political balance was shattered. Land was taken on a scale that reshaped the region. In the north, Tecumseh's death had weakened the dream of a native barrier in the Old Northwest. In the south, Horseshoe Bend broke the Red Stick military challenge and opened a new chapter of American expansion. By 1814, the war against Britain was still unfinished. But for many native peoples, some of the most decisive losses had already happened. The campaigns of 1813 and early 1814 transformed the War of 1812. The United States had entered 1813 embarrassed and angry. By the time the campaigns of Lake Erie, the Thames, and Horseshoe Bend had unfolded, the country had recovered much of its confidence. Detroit had been retaken. British power in the western Great Lakes had been pushed back. Perry had given the nation one of its cleanest victories. Harrison had become the general who answered 1812's humiliation. Jackson had crushed the Red Stick stronghold in the southeast. But recovery came with consequences. The death of Tecumseh was one of the war's great turning points. His confederacy had been the most serious effort to unite native nations across the Old Northwest against American expansion. Without him, resistance continued, but the political center of that movement was badly damaged. British promises of a native buffer would become harder to fulfill and easier to abandon. The Creek War revealed another hard truth. Native communities were not united by a single strategy, and the United States could exploit those divisions. Some native leaders fought with Americans to protect their own towns and futures. Yet American victory still produced land loss on a massive scale. Alliance with the United States did not guarantee safety from American demands. The British, meanwhile, had learned that North America could not be defended by assumption. Canada had survived repeated invasions, but the loss on Lake Erie and the death of Tecumseh weakened the Western position. Still, Britain was not finished. Napoleon's position in Europe was beginning to change. If Britain could eventually send more troops across the Atlantic, the war might enter a more dangerous phase for the United States. That phase was coming. The next chapter would bring larger British offensives, deeper blockades, attacks along the Chesapeake, the burning of Washington, the defense of Baltimore, the battles along the Niagara, and the approach to New Orleans. The war that began with American invasion would soon become a war of American defense. Episode 2 ends at a turning point. The United States had stumbled badly in 1812, but in 1813 it learned how to fight back on the lakes and frontiers. Perry's ships changed the map. Harrison's pursuit ended with Tecumseh dead. Jackson's campaign broke the Red Stick stand at Horseshoe Bend. These victories helped save American pride. They also accelerated American expansion. That is the hard center of this story. The War of 1812 was a contest between the United States and Britain, but it was also a set of wars over native land, sovereignty, and survival. On the Great Lakes and in the Creek Country, the future was not decided only by flags. It was decided by roads, forts, villages, shipyards, alliances, and the terrible cost of defeat. By 1814, the United States had regained momentum. Britain was preparing to strike harder, and the war was about to move from the frontier into the capital itself. By the spring of 1814, the war changed shape again. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon abdicated for the first time in April. Britain had spent more than a decade fighting France with nearly every nerve of imperial power. Now, for the first time since the War of 1812 began, London could look toward North America with more attention, more veterans, more ships, and more confidence. That did not mean Britain suddenly wanted an endless American war. British leaders were exhausted by years of European conflict. They had trade interests to protect and a public tired of taxes and military strain. But they also saw a chance to punish the United States, defend Canada, and enter peace negotiations from a position of strength. For the United States, this was dangerous timing. The country had recovered momentum in 1813. Perry had won Lake Erie. Harrison had retaken Detroit. Tecumseh had fallen at the Thames. Andrew Jackson had crushed the Red Stick stand at Horseshoe Bend. But recovery was not victory. Canada still stood. The Royal Navy still tightened the Atlantic blockade. The American treasury struggled. New England opposition to the war grew louder. and now British pressure was about to become heavier. The war narrowed into three great pressure zones. On the Niagara frontier, the United States would try one more time to prove that its army had matured. The old failures of 1812 could not be repeated forever. A better trained American force would cross into Canada and fight some of the hardest battles of the war. In the Chesapeake, British commanders would turn raiding into shock. The same coastline that had seen fear and disruption would now see a campaign aimed at humiliating the American government itself. In the north, along Lake Champlain, Britain would attempt a major invasion from Canada. If that invasion succeeded, British negotiators at Ghent could demand territory, strategic concessions, and perhaps even a native buffer in the Old Northwest. Native nations watched these movements with grim clarity. Tecumseh was dead, but the causes he fought for had not disappeared. In the southeast, the Treaty of Fort Jackson had just torn millions of acres from the Creek world, including land claimed by communities that had fought beside the United States. In the Old Northwest, many native leaders still hoped Britain might insist on a protected native homeland at the peace table. But hope depended on British battlefield leverage. If Britain won in 1814, the peace might be different. If Britain failed, native allies could be left exposed to the same American expansion they had spent years resisting. The war was no longer young. It had become a test of endurance, memory, and bargaining power. Every burned town, every captured fort, every naval victory, every retreat would travel to the diplomats at Ghent. In 1814, battles would become arguments, and the first argument would be made on the Niagara frontier. The American army that crossed the Niagara River in 1814 was not the same army that had stumbled through the first year of the war. It was still imperfect. It still depended on fragile supply lines, political patience, and officers learning under pressure. But under commanders like Jacob Brown and Winfield Scott, parts of the army had become more disciplined, more drilled, and more professional. Scott in particular pushed regulars through hard training until they could maneuver under fire with the steadiness expected of European troops. That mattered because Niagara had become a proving ground. The United States had invaded Canada before and failed to turn landings into lasting success. In 1814, the army needed more than courage. It needed control. The campaign opened with the capture of Fort Erie in early July. It was a clean beginning, but the true test came almost immediately at Chippewa on July 5, 1814. British commander Phineas Reel expected American militia. What he encountered instead was Scott's trained brigade, advancing with discipline across open ground. The battle became one of the moments when British regulars had to recognize that American regulars could stand and fight in formal battle. The Americans won at Chippewa, and the victory carried symbolic power far beyond the number of casualties. For a republic that had spent 2 years being mocked for failed invasions, Chippewa mattered. It suggested that the United States Army could learn, but Niagara did not give easy rewards. 3 weeks later, on July 25th, the armies collided again near Lundy's Lane, close to Niagara Falls. The battle began late in the day and continued into darkness. Smoke, musket flashes, cannon fire, shouted orders, wounded horses, and confused formations turned the field into a nightmarish contest for a ridge and its guns. Lundy's Lane was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Winfield Scott was severely wounded. British and Canadian forces fought with stubborn endurance. American forces captured guns but struggled to hold the field. Officers fell or were captured. Units became tangled in the dark. Neither side won a clean strategic victory, but both paid heavily enough to remember the ground. The Americans eventually withdrew toward Fort Erie. There, the campaign became a siege. British forces attacked Fort Erie in August, hoping to crush the American foothold. The assault failed at terrible cost. Explosions, close fighting, and confusion ripped through the night. The defenders held, and the British suffered heavily. Later, American sorties added to the violence, but neither side could turn Niagara into the decisive breakthrough planners wanted. By autumn, the Americans abandoned and destroyed Fort Erie, then withdrew. On paper, the campaign had not conquered Canada, but it changed reputations. Chippewa, Lundy's Lane, and Fort Erie showed that the United States could field soldiers capable of meeting British regulars in brutal combat. For Britain, Canada had survived again. For the United States, the army had found a harder kind of respect. For native nations, the result was more troubling. If Britain could defend Canada but not force a decisive settlement, would it spend diplomatic capital defending native land south of the Great Lakes? The answer would depend partly on what happened elsewhere. And elsewhere, British ships were already moving through the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake had been vulnerable from the beginning of the war. Its rivers reached deep into the American interior. Its plantations, towns, shipyards, and roads were exposed to naval power. British ships could appear where American defenses were thin, land raiding parties, burn supplies, seize livestock, destroy public property, and vanish before militia could concentrate. By 1814, British commanders turned that vulnerability into a campaign of pressure. Admiral Alexander Cochrane directed operations in the region. Rear Admiral George Cockburn had already become infamous along the Chesapeake for raids that frightened civilians and embarrassed American authorities. Major General Robert Ross brought disciplined troops who had served in the European War. Together, British naval mobility and veteran infantry created a threat the United States struggled to meet. The British had several aims. They wanted to divert American forces, punish the United States for actions in Canada, disrupt war-making capacity, and damage American morale. They also encouraged enslaved people to flee to British lines. Some joined British service, including the Corps of Colonial Marines, while many sought freedom by reaching British protection. For enslaved families, the war could become a dangerous opening in a system built to trap them. American officials understood the danger, but preparation was uneven. The capital region was politically important, yet militarily exposed. Militias gathered, but many lacked training. Command arrangements were confused. Secretary of War John Armstrong underestimated the likelihood that Washington itself would be attacked, assuming Baltimore was the more obvious prize. In August 1814, British forces landed at Benedict, Maryland, and began moving inland. Their march placed Washington and Baltimore under threat. President Madison, cabinet officials, militia commanders, regulars, sailors, and civilians all tried to respond as the crisis unfolded faster than confidence. The decisive approach came at Bladensburg on August 24th. American forces formed to block the road to Washington. Some fought bravely, including naval gun crews under Joshua Barney, whose men served their artillery with determination. But the broader defense cracked. British rockets and disciplined infantry pressure unnerved militia formations. Units broke and fled. The collapse became so notorious that it entered memory as the Bladensburg races. The road to Washington opened. Inside the capital, panic spread. Government papers were gathered, officials fled. Dolly Madison famously arranged for the removal of George Washington's portrait from the executive mansion before leaving. The image endured because it captured the symbolic stakes of the moment. The young republic's capital was about to fall, and its memory of founding had to be carried out before flames arrived. By evening, British troops entered Washington. The United States had won victories in the West, but now its capital stood exposed before an enemy column. The war had reached the doors of government. Washington was not occupied like a conquered imperial capital. The British raid was brief, targeted, and symbolic. That did not make it less shocking. British troops set fire to public buildings, including the Capitol, the Executive Mansion, and government offices. Flames rose through a city that was still unfinished, scattered and young, but politically enormous in meaning. The Republic had declared war on the world's most powerful maritime empire. Now that empire had marched into its capital and burned the structures that represented national authority. The destruction carried several messages at once. It punished the United States for the burning of public buildings in Upper Canada, especially the memory of York. It demonstrated British reach. It humiliated Madison's administration. It warned Americans that distance from the Atlantic did not equal safety. Civilians watched the glow with fear, anger, and disbelief. Some British officers tried to limit destruction to public property, but war does not arrive as a clean instrument. The emotional effect spread far beyond the buildings themselves. If Washington could burn, what else could happen? Then weather intervened. A violent storm swept through the city, bringing heavy rain and fierce winds. Later memory gave the storm an almost providential character, as if nature itself had answered the flames. In practical terms, it helped end the fires and disrupted the British force. Ross and Cockburn did not intend to hold Washington. After completing the raid, they withdrew. Militarily, the burning of Washington did not destroy the United States. The government survived. Madison continued. The war went on. Politically, it was a humiliation that demanded an answer. That answer would come at Baltimore. Baltimore was not merely another city. It was a major port, a center of privateering, and a symbol of American defiance at sea. British officials considered it a nest of privateers whose ships had preyed on British commerce. If Washington was the symbolic heart, Baltimore was a fighting harbor. The city prepared seriously. Earthworks strengthened approaches. Militia gathered. Fort McHenry guarded the harbor. Citizens understood what had happened in Washington and knew that they might be next. The British came north from the Chesapeake expecting another blow, but Baltimore would not be Bladensburg. The defense of Baltimore began on land. On September 12, 1814, British troops advanced toward the city and met American defenders at North Point. The fighting was sharp and costly. Early in the action, Major General Robert Ross was mortally wounded, a major blow to British command. American forces eventually fell back toward the city's main defenses, but they had delayed the British advance and bloodied the attack. Baltimore's defenders had something Washington lacked: prepared positions, clearer local resolve, and the fresh memory of what failure could mean. The British Army hesitated before the defenses east of the city. A direct assault would be dangerous without naval support. That made Fort McHenry the key. On September 13th, British ships opened a long bombardment of the fort. Mortar shells and rockets arced through the night. Inside Fort McHenry, American defenders under Major George Armistead endured the fire. The British hoped to force the fort's surrender or open the harbor for attack. But the fort held. Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer who had gone under a flag of truce to help secure a prisoner's release, watched the bombardment from a British vessel. Through the night, the question was whether the fort had surrendered. At dawn, the great garrison flag still flew. Key wrote the words that became the Star-Spangled Banner. The moment mattered because it reversed the emotional direction of the Chesapeake campaign. Washington had burned, Baltimore endured. The British had shown they could strike the capital, but they had not broken American will. Instead, Baltimore became a story of resistance. The British withdrew from the attack. In the larger war, Baltimore did not win Canada. It did not end the blockade. It did not solve American financial problems or political divisions. But morale matters in wartime, and symbols can travel faster than armies. The sight of the flag over Fort McHenry offered Americans a counter-image to the flames of Washington. It also affected negotiations indirectly. Britain could threaten the coast and win raids, but could it force the United States into humiliating terms? That depended on whether British armies could win decisive ground. The next chance came far to the north, where a British invasion moved toward Lake Champlain. If one battle in 1814 did the most to shape the peace, it may have been Plattsburgh. The British plan was ambitious. Governor-General George Prevost led a large force south from Canada toward Plattsburgh, New York. With Napoleon temporarily defeated, Britain could send veteran troops across the Atlantic. A successful invasion down the Lake Champlain corridor could threaten New York, strengthen Britain's hand at Ghent, and perhaps force the United States to accept harsh terms. But land power depended on lake power. On Lake Champlain, American naval commander Thomas McDonough prepared carefully. He anchored his squadron in Plattsburgh Bay, choosing a position that forced the British to fight on terms he understood. McDonough's preparations included anchors and lines that allowed his ships to pivot, bringing fresh broadsides to bear when one side had been damaged. British naval commander George Downey brought his squadron into action on September 11, 1814. The battle was fierce. Cannon smoke rolled across the water, masts cracked, men fought guns on decks slippery with blood and splinters. Downey was killed early. McDonough's flagship Saratoga took punishment, but his anchoring plan allowed him to rotate the ship and unleash an undamaged side. The British squadron was defeated. Without control of the lake, Prevost's army could not safely continue. He retreated back into Canada. British officers criticized the withdrawal, and Prevost's reputation suffered badly. For the United States, the victory was enormous. Plattsburgh mattered because it denied Britain the leverage it needed. At Ghent, British negotiators had explored demands that could have reshaped the post-war frontier, including ideas connected to a native buffer state. But battlefield reality narrowed what diplomacy could sustain. The British had burned Washington but failed at Baltimore. They had fought hard on the Niagara frontier but had not conquered decisive ground. At Plattsburgh, their major northern invasion collapsed. That made status quo peace more likely. For native allies of Britain, this was devastating. A native buffer depended on British willingness and British leverage. If Britain could not force the United States to accept it, the demand would fade. Native nations had fought for survival. Diplomacy would soon show how little imperial alliance guaranteed. By late 1814, the war was moving toward its final act. Peace talks continued in Europe. New England Federalists gathered in anger at Hartford. In the South, Andrew Jackson moved toward New Orleans, where a British expedition would test the Mississippi Gateway after the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed, but before news arrived. The War of 1812 had become a strange thing, a conflict where the most famous American victory would come after peace was made, and where many of the deepest consequences would fall on native nations long after the cannon stopped. By the end of 1814, the War of 1812 had produced no simple winner. Britain had defended Canada, blockaded the coast, burned Washington, and shown the reach of imperial power. But it had not broken the United States, had not taken Baltimore, and had failed to turn Plattsburgh into a northern triumph. The United States had failed to conquer Canada, suffered humiliation at the capital, and endured economic strain and political division. But it had recovered from the disasters of 1812, won Lake Erie, retaken Detroit, broken the British Allied western position at the Thames, crushed the Red Stick resistance at Horseshoe Bend, fought respectably on the Niagara frontier, held Baltimore, and stopped the Lake Champlain invasion. In Washington, the burning of public buildings became a wound and a warning. In Baltimore, the flag over Fort McHenry became a promise. On the Niagara frontier, soldiers who had once been dismissed as amateurs had forced British regulars into some of the hardest fighting of the war. At Plattsburgh, naval preparation and battlefield geography had changed the diplomatic future. Yet for native nations, the pattern was darker. Tecumseh was gone. The Creek land cessions after Horseshoe Bend revealed how victory beside the United States could still end in dispossession. British diplomats, facing limited leverage and larger imperial priorities, moved away from insisting on a native buffer state. The peace that approached would restore boundaries between the United States and Britain, but it would not restore native power, lost in battle, treaty, and abandonment. That is why 1814 cannot be remembered only as Washington burning or Baltimore holding. It was also the year when the diplomatic possibilities for native sovereignty narrowed sharply. The war between states was moving toward a draw. The struggle over land inside the continent was not. The next episode will carry the story into its final turn. The Treaty of Ghent, the Hartford Convention, the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson's rise, and the post-war consequences that pushed the story from the War of 1812 into the Long Age of Removal and the Seminole Wars. In 1813, the lakes caught fire. In 1814, the Empire struck back. And by the time the smoke cleared over Washington, Baltimore, Plattsburgh, and the Gulf Coast, the war was already becoming memory, myth, and unfinished business. By late 1814, the War of 1812 had become a contradiction. In Europe, diplomats were trying to end it. In North America, armies were still preparing to fight. The United States had survived the burning of Washington, held Baltimore, stopped the British invasion at Plattsburgh, and endured the strain of blockade and political division. Britain had defended Canada, punished the Chesapeake, and failed to force the decisive victory that would let it dictate a harsh peace. At Ghent, American and British negotiators worked through a war that neither side had truly won. The British had entered talks with larger ambitions, including demands shaped by native alliances and the idea of a protected native buffer in the Old Northwest. But diplomacy follows power. After Baltimore and Plattsburgh, Britain no longer had the leverage to force those terms. The American negotiators were not united in personality, but they were united in one essential goal: no surrender of national territory and no British-controlled native barrier inside the continent. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, James A. Bayard, and Jonathan Russell brought different temperaments to the table, but together they defended the Republic's territorial future. For native nations who had fought beside Britain, this was the great betrayal hidden inside the peace. Tecumseh was dead. The Creek world had been devastated. The British had encouraged native resistance when it served imperial defense, but now the empire was tired. Europe mattered more, and London was not willing to continue the war for a native homeland south of the Great Lakes. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Its terms were strikingly modest. Conquered territory would be restored. Commissions would settle boundary questions. The great maritime grievances that had helped bring on the war, including impressment, were not directly resolved in the treaty. But the wider European war had changed the context. With Napoleon defeated, the old maritime crisis was less urgent. The treaty did not instantly end fighting. News still had to cross the Atlantic. Ships still sailed under wartime orders. Commanders still acted on old plans. In an age before telegraphs, peace could exist on paper while armies marched toward bloodshed. That is why the final famous battle of the War of 1812 would be fought after the treaty was signed. The destination was New Orleans. For Britain, New Orleans was a prize of enormous strategic meaning. It guarded the mouth of the Mississippi River, the commercial artery of the American West. If Britain could seize it, even temporarily, it might gain leverage over the Mississippi Valley and the Gulf Coast. For Americans in Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and the Mississippi Territory, the river was not distant geography. It was the route by which farms, towns, and futures reached the world. Andrew Jackson understood this. He had just emerged from the Creek War with a reputation for relentless command. Horseshoe Bend and the Treaty of Fort Jackson had made him a powerful figure in the South. Now he faced a new test, defending a diverse, exposed, strategically essential city at the edge of empire. New Orleans was not simply American or French or Spanish or Caribbean. It was all of those things at once: Creole, enslaved, free black, immigrant, Catholic, commercial, multilingual, and wary of outside authority. To defend it, Jackson would have to gather regular soldiers, militia, sailors, free men of color, Choctaw allies, local volunteers, and even smugglers whose loyalty had recently been uncertain. Peace had been signed at Ghent, but on the Gulf Coast, the war was about to roar one last time. While Jackson prepared in the South, the United States faced a crisis of confidence in New England. The war had never been equally popular across the country. In the South and West, many supporters saw it as a defense of honor, commerce, and expansion. In New England, many Federalists saw it as a reckless Republican war that damaged trade, strengthened political enemies, and exposed coastal towns to ruin. The British blockade hurt commerce. The national government struggled with money. Militia disputes raised constitutional questions. By late 1814, anger in New England had hardened enough to produce the Hartford Convention. Delegates from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and parts of New Hampshire and Vermont met in secret in Hartford, Connecticut, beginning in December. They discussed grievances against the Madison administration and proposed constitutional amendments meant to limit the political power of the South and West. Their complaints included restrictions on embargoes, declarations of war, admission of new states, and the 3/5 clause's effect on representation. Rumors made the convention sound more dangerous than the surviving record proves. Some Americans feared secession. The delegates did not formally call for it, but secrecy was politically disastrous. At the very moment Americans were about to celebrate New Orleans and receive news of peace, the Hartford Convention would be remembered as disloyal, sectional, and out of step with national feeling. The timing destroyed the Federalists. Before news of the Treaty of Ghent and New Orleans reached Washington, Federalist complaints still had force. The war had been costly. Washington had burned. The blockade had damaged the economy. The army had failed to conquer Canada. But once peace and victory arrived together in public imagination, the story changed. The war became proof that the Republic had stood up to Britain again. The Federalists looked as if they had doubted the nation at the moment the nation was proving itself. This mattered beyond party politics. The collapse of the Federalists helped open the so-called era of good feelings, when one-party Republican dominance obscured, but did not erase, deep conflicts over slavery, expansion, finance, and native land. The war's end did not create unity as much as it rearranged the arguments. New Orleans would become the emotional answer to Hartford. If Hartford represented division, New Orleans would be remembered as unity. If Hartford whispered of constitutional grievance, New Orleans would shout of flags, cannon, river mud, and frontier resolve. That memory was too simple, but it was powerful. It made Andrew Jackson a national hero and transformed a complicated war into a usable patriotic story. Yet even before the battle, New Orleans was not a neat symbol. It was a city built on slavery and commerce, defended by people with very different stakes in American power. Some fought for the Republic, some fought for local survival. Some fought because war gave them a chance to claim status, protection, or freedom. Some were forced by the structures around them. The Battle of New Orleans would be remembered as a miracle of national unity. On the ground, it was something more layered, an improvised coalition defending a borderland city from an Imperial army. The British expedition against New Orleans began as part of a wider Gulf campaign. British forces had already probed the region. They had used Pensacola in Spanish Florida as a base of influence, working with native allies and threatening the American southern frontier. Jackson had marched against Pensacola in November 1814, forcing the British to withdraw and making clear that he would not tolerate Spanish neutrality when it shielded British operations. But Pensacola was only a prelude. The larger British aim was the Mississippi. A successful blow against New Orleans could threaten the American West, disrupt commerce, and perhaps strengthen Britain's position if peace terms remained unsettled. The British sent a major expedition under experienced commanders, including Admiral Alexander Cochrane, Vice Admiral Edward Codrington, Major General John Keane, and later Major General Edward Pakenham, a respected officer and the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law. The approach to New Orleans was difficult. The city was protected by water, marsh, bayou, lake, and river. That geography could shield it or expose it, depending on who understood the routes. British ships entered Lake Bourne, east of the city. There, American gunboats under Thomas Ap Catesby Jones tried to delay them. The Americans were outnumbered and eventually overwhelmed, but the fight bought time. Time mattered. Jackson arrived in New Orleans and found a city anxious, politically divided, and vulnerable. He imposed martial law, a decision that would later become controversial, but in the moment he believed speed and discipline were essential. He recruited broadly: Louisiana militia, Tennessee riflemen, Kentucky militia, U.S. regulars, sailors, Marines, free men of color, Choctaw warriors, local Creoles, and Jean Lafitte's Baratarians all became part of the defense. Lafitte's role captured the strange politics of the Gulf. His Baratarians had been smugglers and privateers operating from the Louisiana coast. The British tried to recruit them. Lafitte instead offered support to the Americans, and Jackson, who needed artillerymen and local knowledge, accepted help from men he might otherwise have condemned. The British moved through difficult waterways and reached the Mississippi's east bank below New Orleans. On December 23, 1814, American forces launched a night attack against the British camp. The fighting was confused and fierce, but it disrupted British confidence. Jackson's men showed that the city would not be taken passively. After the night battle, Jackson chose a defensive position along the Rodriguez Canal, a ditch running from the Mississippi toward the cypress swamp. There he built Line Jackson. Earth, cotton bales, timber, mud, and labor became a wall. Cannon were placed to command the open ground. The Mississippi protected one flank, the swamp limited the other. The British faced a narrow battlefield. If they could break the line, New Orleans might fall. If they failed, their army would be trapped in a costly assault against prepared defenses. The final attack was coming. Line Jackson was not beautiful. It was practical, muddy, improvised, and deadly. Men worked with shovels, axes, carts, and whatever materials could be found. The Rodriguez Canal was widened and strengthened. Earthworks rose behind it. Artillery positions took shape. Sailors and Baratarians served guns. Riflemen found places along the line. Free black battalions, Louisiana militia, regulars, Tennesseans, Kentuckians, Choctaw allies, and local volunteers held a position that reflected the city's complexity. Jackson's command style was harsh and magnetic. He could inspire loyalty, but he also demanded obedience with little patience for hesitation. Martial law gave him sweeping authority over New Orleans. Some civilians resented it, some feared it, others accepted it as the price of survival. The British tested the line before the final assault. On January 1st, 1815, they opened an artillery duel. British guns hammered the American defenses, but Jackson's artillery answered effectively. The defenders held. The British learned that the American line could not easily be battered into submission. Major General Edward Pakenham now faced a decision. He had disciplined troops, but the ground was terrible for attack. The open field before Line Jackson exposed advancing soldiers to artillery and rifle fire. The swamp and river limited maneuver. The plan required coordination across the river, as well as a main assault on the east bank. Scaling ladders and fascines were needed to cross the ditch and climb the works. Any delay, confusion, or missing equipment could turn discipline into slaughter. On the American side, the defenders waited. Many were not professional soldiers. Some had marched hundreds of miles, some had been hastily organized. Some spoke French or Spanish more readily than English. Some had been denied full citizenship or equality in the society they now defended. Yet the line gave them an advantage. Behind earthworks, with artillery placed well and the enemy forced across open ground, the defenders could turn diversity into firepower. The Battle of New Orleans is often remembered as a simple frontier victory. Jackson's riflemen cutting down British regulars. The truth is broader. Artillery was crucial. Terrain was crucial. Naval delays were crucial. Local knowledge mattered. The night attack mattered. Free men of color mattered. Baratarians mattered. Choctaw allies mattered. The city itself, with all its contradictions, mattered. Jackson did not win with one type of American. He won with a coalition that existed because New Orleans was a crossroads of empires. Before dawn on January 8th, British columns formed for the attack. The air was cold, fog hung over the field. Men carried ladders, muskets, flags, and orders that depended on timing. Across the open ground, American guns waited. The last great battle of the war was about to begin. The British assault on January 8, 1815, went wrong almost from the beginning. The attack required coordination, but coordination failed. Some troops moved without the necessary ladders and fascines. The battlefield was exposed, fog lifted. American artillery and small arms fire struck advancing formations. British soldiers kept moving with courage, but courage could not erase the geometry of the field. Pakenham tried to rally the assault and was mortally wounded. Other senior officers fell. Units pressed forward into a storm of fire, then broke or stalled before the American line. On the west bank of the Mississippi, British forces had more success against American positions. But the failure of the main attack made that success useless. The casualties were lopsided. British losses were severe. American losses behind the line were comparatively light. New Orleans held. The victory arrived at exactly the moment Americans needed a story of redemption. Washington had burned. The invasion of Canada had failed. The war had strained the economy and nearly broken national confidence. Now, at the mouth of the Mississippi, an American army under Andrew Jackson had destroyed a British assault and defended the West's commercial lifeline. News of the battle traveled with astonishing emotional force. By the time many Americans learned of New Orleans, they also learned that peace had been signed. In public memory, the two events fused. The treaty ended the war. New Orleans made it feel won. That distinction matters. The Treaty of Ghent did not mention New Orleans because it had already been signed. But politically, New Orleans transformed the meaning of the treaty. A status quo peace could now be celebrated as national vindication. The United States had not conquered Canada. It had not forced Britain to renounce impressment in writing. It had not achieved many of the goals war supporters had once imagined. But it had survived. It had fought Britain again. It had ended the war with a spectacular victory. Andrew Jackson became the embodiment of that memory. His fame would carry him from general to political icon, from New Orleans to the presidency. But the same qualities that made Jackson a wartime hero would later shape policies of coercion, expansion, and removal. New Orleans built the legend. The borderland wars that followed revealed what that legend would mean for native nations and for the South. The British withdrew from New Orleans, but the Gulf frontier did not become peaceful. The War of 1812 was ending between the United States and Britain. Yet in the southern borderlands, the violence had already become something else. A struggle over runaway slaves, native sovereignty, Spanish weakness, American expansion, and the meaning of security along a frontier no treaty had truly calmed. The cannons at New Orleans fell silent. The Borderland War continued. In February 1815, the Treaty of Ghent was ratified by the United States. The War of 1812 was officially over. Americans celebrated, but the peace had uneven meanings. Along the Atlantic coast, commerce could revive. In Washington, Madison's administration could claim survival. In the West and South, many people saw the war as proof that the Republic could defend its expansion. For veterans of New Orleans, the victory became a source of pride for decades. For native nations, the meaning was darker. The treaty restored territory between Britain and the United States, but it did not restore the political power native allies had lost. British support had receded. Tecumseh's confederacy had been shattered. The Creek War had ended with a huge land cession. The demand for a native buffer state disappeared from the final peace. In the South, the Treaty of Fort Jackson cast a long shadow. Creek communities, including some who had not fought against the United States, were forced to give up vast lands. The settlement deepened resentment, displacement, and instability. Many Creek refugees moved south into Spanish Florida, joining or living near Seminole communities and other native groups. Spanish Florida became the unresolved frontier. Spain was weaker than it had once been. Its empire was strained by wars in Europe and revolutions in Latin America. Florida was thinly defended, difficult to govern, and entangled with native towns, maroon communities, British agents, traders, and American pressure. To U.S. officials and Southern slaveholders, Florida looked like a danger, a place where native resistance could regroup and enslaved people could flee beyond American reach. To many refugees, Florida looked like survival. Seminole identity itself was shaped by movement, alliance, and autonomy. The Seminoles were not simply one old nation standing still. They included native communities with Creek connections and other roots, building towns in a borderland where Spanish authority was limited and American power was still contested. Black Seminoles and other people of African descent, including fugitives from slavery, formed communities connected to Seminole towns through alliance, tribute, family, and mutual defense. This world terrified the slaveholding South. The end of the War of 1812 therefore did not end war aims. It redirected them. American leaders increasingly treated Spanish Florida as a problem to be solved. Southern planters demanded security. Military officers watched the border. Native towns tried to preserve autonomy. Black refugees tried to defend fragile freedom. The next flashpoint stood on the Apalachicola River. Americans called it the Negro Fort. During the War of 1812, the British had built a post at Prospect Bluff on the Apalachicola River in Spanish Florida. When British forces withdrew, they left behind weapons, supplies, and a fortified position. The fort became occupied by people of African descent, many formerly enslaved, along with native allies and families. To those inside, it was a refuge and a defensive stronghold. To U.S. officials and Southern slaveholders, it was a nightmare. An armed black community near the border, connected to native resistance and beyond direct American control. Americans called it the Negro Fort. The name itself reflected white fear more than the community's full reality. The fort represented the possibility that enslaved people could escape, arm themselves, and survive with allies in the borderlands. In the slaveholding imagination, that possibility was intolerable. In 1816, U.S. forces moved against the fort. Gunboats ascended the river. The confrontation ended catastrophically when a heated shot struck the fort's powder magazine. The explosion destroyed the fort and killed many inside. The destruction of the fort was not only a military event, it was a signal. The United States would not tolerate armed sanctuary for fugitives from slavery near its southern border. The border between Georgia and Florida would be treated not simply as a line between nations, but as a zone where slavery, native sovereignty, and American expansion collided. The survivors and surrounding communities did not vanish from history. Black Seminoles, Red Stick refugees, and other borderland people continued to navigate danger, alliance, and movement. But the destruction at Prospect Bluff showed how violently the United States would respond when Black freedom and Native autonomy reinforced one another. After 1816, tensions deepened. Fort Scott became an American military post near the border. Foultown, a Lower Creek village led by Neamathla, resisted American claims and pressure. U.S. officers treated that resistance as a threat. The line between policing, retaliation, and invasion began to blur. Late in 1817, violence at Foultown and attacks along the Apalachicola escalated into open conflict. The Scott Massacre, in which a U.S. boat carrying soldiers, women, and children was attacked on the Apalachicola, intensified demands for retaliation. Fear, revenge, and expansion now moved together. The United States called on Andrew Jackson. Jackson saw the Florida border in blunt terms. If Spanish authorities could not control Native and Black resistance from Florida, he believed the United States had the right to act. This logic would drive him beyond the border and into one of the most controversial military campaigns of his career. The First Seminole War was about to begin. In 1818, Andrew Jackson marched into Spanish Florida. He had orders to pursue hostile native forces, but his campaign quickly exceeded cautious limits. Jackson believed delay and diplomacy only protected enemies. His solution was direct force: strike towns, seize supplies, destroy sanctuaries, and confront the Spanish posts that, in his view, allowed the border war to continue. Jackson's army included U.S. regulars, Tennessee volunteers, Georgia militia, and allied native fighters. They moved through a landscape of rivers, pine woods, swamps, abandoned fields, and towns already strained by years of war and displacement. Seminole and Red Stick communities withdrew, scattered, or resisted where they could. The campaign was not a single clean battle. It was a hard march through a borderland society. Jackson destroyed the village of Coacoochee and other settlements. He pursued leaders associated with resistance. He treated Spanish neutrality as either weakness or deception. In April 1818, he seized the Spanish post at St. Mark's. There, two British subjects, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, were captured and accused of aiding native resistance. Jackson had them tried by military tribunal. Arbuthnot was hanged. Ambrister was executed after a controversial proceeding in which the tribunal's sentence became entangled with Jackson's own will. The executions created an international crisis. Britain was at peace with the United States. Spain still owned Florida. Jackson had invaded Spanish territory, seized Spanish posts, and executed British subjects. To supporters, he had acted decisively against a dangerous frontier network. To critics, he had behaved like a military dictator. Jackson was not finished. He moved west and seized Pensacola, the capital of Spanish West Florida, after Spanish authorities protested but could not stop him. Once again, Jackson justified action by arguing that Spain had failed to control threats from its own territory. The campaign's military success was clear. Jackson had demonstrated that Spanish Florida could not resist American force. The political meaning was more explosive. Had he gone too far? Had he risked war with Spain and Britain? Had he violated orders? Or had he revealed a truth diplomats could no longer ignore? Spain could not hold Florida against American pressure. President James Monroe's administration faced a choice. Secretary of War John C. Calhoun privately wanted Jackson censured. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams defended him with cold strategic brilliance. Adams argued that Spain's inability to police Florida made American action understandable and that the real solution was for Spain to cede the territory. Jackson crossed the line with an army. Adams turned that crossing into diplomacy. The First Seminole War did not immediately annex Florida, but it made annexation feel inevitable. Spain protested Jackson's invasion, but Spain's position was weak. Its empire in the Americas was under pressure from independence movements. Florida produced more trouble than strength. It was expensive to defend, thinly settled by Spanish authority, and vulnerable to U.S. military action whenever Washington chose to act. John Quincy Adams used the crisis to press Spain. His argument was not sentimental, it was strategic. If Spain could not control Florida, and if Florida became a base for raids, fugitives, and foreign intrigue, then the United States would continue acting in self-defense. Better for Spain to negotiate than to watch Florida slip away by force. The result was the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Spain ceded Florida to the United States. In return, the United States assumed certain claims by American citizens against Spain and recognized Spanish claims to Texas, at least for the moment. The treaty also defined a boundary between U.S. territory and Spanish possessions stretching toward the Pacific. Florida's transfer was a major expansion of American power. It secured the southeastern coastline, tightened U.S. control over the Gulf, and removed a European buffer that had sheltered Native and Black communities from direct American rule. For white Southern slaveholders, this was a victory for security. For Seminoles, Black Seminoles, and other borderland refugees, it was a warning. The line that once offered space for negotiation and refuge was closing. Spanish weakness had allowed a complicated world to survive. American sovereignty would bring roads, forts, land hunger, slave catchers, treaties, pressure, and eventually removal. The War of 1812 and the First Seminole War therefore belong in the same story. One ended with a treaty that restored borders between Britain and the United States. The other helped erase a border that had limited American power in the Southeast. One created the myth of New Orleans and national vindication. The other showed how that new confidence would be used against Native nations and Black refuge communities. Andrew Jackson stood at the center of both. At New Orleans, he defended the Republic. In Florida, he expanded its reach. To admirers, he was the man who protected American security when politicians hesitated. To those in the path of American power, he was the face of invasion, coercion, and dispossession. The age after the War of 1812 was not an age of peace for everyone. It was an age when victory became expansion. New Orleans became more than a battle almost immediately. It became a national story. Americans remembered the field below the city as proof that the Republic had matured. The details were complicated, but memory simplified them. A diverse defensive coalition became a symbol of one people. A battle fought after peace had been signed became the victory that seemed to win the war. A status quo treaty became a triumph. Andrew Jackson became the man who had done what the country wanted to believe it had done: stand firm, strike back, and humble Britain. Songs, speeches, newspapers, veteran stories, and political celebrations carried the battle into legend. The geography helped. New Orleans guarded the Mississippi, and the Mississippi represented the future. Western farmers, merchants, planters, and politicians could all understand what it meant for the river to stay open. The battle did not merely defend one city. In American imagination, it defended the West. The memory also helped cover over discomfort. The War of 1812 had been messy. The United States had invaded Canada and failed. Washington had burned. The blockade had exposed economic weakness. The army had often struggled. New England Federalists had opposed the war so strongly that Hartford became a political wound. The Treaty of Ghent restored the old boundaries without resolving many of the grievances that had originally animated the conflict. New Orleans made all of that easier to bear. The victory gave the war a clean ending in public memory, even though the actual ending had been negotiated in Europe. It allowed Americans to speak of the conflict as a second war of independence, a phrase that captured emotion more than diplomatic precision. Britain had not reconquered the United States. The Republic had survived. That was enough for national mythology, but mythology chooses what to emphasize. It emphasized Jackson, but often softened the coalition around him. It celebrated riflemen, but sometimes overlooked artillery. Sailors, free men of color, Creoles, Baratarians, Choctaw allies, enslaved laborers, and the city's complicated social world. It celebrated national defense, but often ignored the fact that many defenders lived inside a society that denied liberty to others. The myth was powerful because it was partly true. New Orleans really was a remarkable victory. The defenders really did hold under pressure. The British Army really did suffer a devastating defeat. Jackson really did impose order on a frightened city and turn geography into advantage. But the myth was dangerous because it made force look simple. It taught many Americans that decisive violence could solve borderland problems, that a strong commander could cut through hesitation and that expansion could be framed as defense. That lesson would follow Jackson into Florida. To understand why Florida mattered so much after 1815, we have to see it as more than a Spanish possession waiting to become American. It was a refuge. For native communities pushed by war and land hunger, Florida offered distance from U.S. power. For Red Stick refugees after the Creek War, it offered a place to regroup beyond the immediate reach of American officials. For enslaved people fleeing plantations in Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, it offered the possibility of freedom, protection, and alliance. For Black Seminoles and Maroon communities, it offered a world that was dangerous but not hopeless. That made Florida unacceptable to the slaveholding South. Slaveholders did not see the border as a neutral line. They saw it as a leak in the system of slavery. Every successful escape challenged property claims, racial control, and the authority of masters. When fugitives found weapons, families, farms, and native allies, the fear became political. Southern leaders demanded action not only against raids, but against the possibility of armed Black autonomy. Native sovereignty and Black freedom became linked in the minds of American officials. That link shaped the coming wars. U.S. leaders often described Seminole resistance as a security problem, but security meant many things at once. Stopping raids, recovering enslaved people, preventing British or Spanish influence, opening land, and proving that no community near the southern border could defy American power. Spanish officials could not satisfy these demands. They lacked the soldiers, money, and local authority to police Florida the way Washington and Southern planters wanted. Seminole towns did not simply obey Spanish orders. Black refuge communities had their own interests. Traders, British agents, and local power brokers moved through the region in ways that made formal sovereignty look thin. This was the borderland reality Jackson entered. He did not invent the pressures. The Creek War, the War of 1812, slavery, Spanish weakness, and American expansion had already created them. But Jackson gave those pressures a military form. He believed sanctuary across a border was not a shield. He believed weak sovereignty did not deserve respect if it endangered American security. He believed speed and punishment could accomplish what diplomacy delayed. The First Seminole War was therefore not a random postscript. It was the War of 1812's southern aftermath. The same Gulf world, the same anxieties over British influence, the same Creek displacement, the same American hunger for land and security, and the same unwillingness to accept native or Black autonomy when it blocked expansion. The United States had won its patriotic ending at New Orleans. Now it would decide what victory permitted. By 1819, the United States had changed. It had survived a second war with Britain. It had celebrated New Orleans. It had watched the Federalist Party collapse. It had pressed Spain towards ceding Florida. It had seen Andrew Jackson become one of the most famous men in the country. But the deeper changes were still unfolding. The war strengthened a national story of resilience, but it also accelerated the destruction of native power in the East. Tecumseh's confederacy was gone. The Creek Nation had been forced into devastating cessions. Seminole autonomy now faced the direct pressure of the United States. Black refugee communities in Florida had learned that American slavery would pursue them beyond old borders. The United States emerged from the war with confidence that its future lay west and south. Roads, cotton, land speculation, slavery, military posts, and treaties would push into native homelands. The federal government would speak the language of civilization, security, and legality. Settlers would speak the language of opportunity. Armies would arrive when words failed. Jackson's rise mattered because he embodied that future. His supporters saw him as the defender of New Orleans, the conqueror of chaos, the man who acted when others debated. His critics saw danger in his willingness to impose martial law, invade foreign territory, and execute men under controversial authority. Both views were part of the same figure. Jackson's appeal came from the same force that made him frightening. For the epic history recap story, Episode 3 is the hinge. It closes the War of 1812 as a formal conflict between the United States and Britain. It opens the next phase of the Indian Wars as a struggle over the southern borderlands. The battlefield shifts from New Orleans to Florida. The enemy shifts from British regulars to native towns, Black refuge communities, and Spanish weakness. The language shifts from national defense to frontier security, but the momentum is continuous. New Orleans gave Americans a heroic ending. The First Seminole War showed what came after the applause. Florida became American. The Seminoles remained unconquered. Black Seminole communities adapted and endured. The questions left unresolved would return with even greater force in the years ahead. The next chapters of this series will move deeper into the Age of Removal, the pressure on native nations in the Southeast, the rise of Jacksonian democracy, the Indian Removal Act, and the long road toward the Second Seminole War. The War of 1812 ended with a flag, a treaty, and a hero. Its aftermath began with a border crossing, and on that border, the future of the United States came into focus. Powerful, confident, expanding, and impossible to separate from the people it pushed aside. When Spain ceded Florida to the United States, the map changed faster than the ground. The Adams-Onis Treaty was signed in 1819 and took effect in 1821. On paper, Florida became American. In practice, it remained a borderland of forests, rivers, swamps, old Spanish towns, Seminole communities, black Seminole settlements, military posts, traders, enslaved people, fugitives from slavery, and settlers arriving with new expectations. For the United States, Florida was supposed to solve a problem. Spain had been too weak to control the territory. American leaders had complained that Seminole towns, Red Stick refugees, and black refugee communities used Florida as a shelter from U.S. power. Southern slaveholders saw the peninsula as a place where enslaved people could escape and where native allies could protect them. Military officers saw it as a security problem. Land-hungry settlers saw opportunity, but acquiring Florida did not make the problem disappear. It brought the United States directly into it. Seminole communities did not view themselves as loose obstacles on an empty map. They had towns, fields, cattle, kinship networks, trade connections, and political leaders. Some families had Creek roots, others had lived in Florida for generations. They were connected to the larger native South, but they were also shaped by Florida itself, its wetlands, hammocks, pine woods, rivers, and refuge spaces. Black Seminoles and other people of African descent were central to this world. Some were fugitives from slavery. Some were born in Florida. Some lived in villages near Seminole towns, paying tribute or maintaining alliances while preserving degrees of autonomy. Their existence challenged the slaveholding order. They knew the land, raised crops and livestock, carried weapons, and understood that American rule could bring slave catchers and forced removal. The United States did not inherit a quiet province. It inherited a contested refuge. Andrew Jackson briefly served as Florida's military governor in 1821. His presence symbolized the new order. The hero of New Orleans and invader of Spanish Florida now stood as the face of American sovereignty. But even Jackson could not simply command Florida into submission. The territory was too large, too difficult, and too politically tangled. The question became whether native and black communities could remain inside a Florida that American settlers increasingly imagined as theirs. The answer would come through treaties, pressure, law, fraud, military force, and resistance. Indian removal was not an abstract policy born only in Washington. It grew from land hunger. Across the Southeast, cotton changed the stakes. The cotton gin, expanding markets, slave labor, and aggressive land speculation made native homelands look to white settlers and planters like wealth waiting behind a legal barrier. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee pushed harder and harder against native sovereignty. Roads, surveys, state laws, debt, and settler intrusion all became tools of pressure. The United States had long claimed that native nations could either assimilate or cede land and move west. Presidents before Jackson had supported versions of civilization policy, treaty-making, and relocation. Missionaries, agents, and officials spoke of farming, schools, Christianity, written laws, and private property as supposed paths to survival. But when native nations adopted some of those tools, it did not protect them. Cherokee leaders built a constitutional government, developed a written legal system, supported education, and published the Cherokee Phoenix. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Cherokee leaders negotiated, adapted, resisted, and divided over how to respond to U.S. power. These were not societies frozen in time. They were nations making choices under pressure. Yet adaptation could not satisfy the hunger for land. To many Southern politicians, native sovereignty inside state borders became intolerable precisely because it worked. If a native nation could modernize, write laws, run schools, and still keep its land, the entire settler argument weakened. The goal was not simply to make native people change. The goal was to open the land. Slavery intensified everything. Cotton expansion required land and enslaved labor. The same states demanding removal were often the states most invested in plantation growth. Indian removal and the spread of slavery were not separate stories. They moved together across the southern map. Florida fit this pattern, but with an additional fear. In Florida, Seminole resistance was tied in American minds to black freedom. A Seminole town could be described as hostile. A black Seminole settlement could be described as a threat to slavery itself. A refugee could be labeled stolen property. A community defending itself could be treated as criminal. This is why the struggle after the War of 1812 did not fade. The war had broken old native alliances with Britain and helped remove Spanish power from Florida. But the deeper contest over land, slavery, sovereignty, and refuge grew stronger. The United States preferred to make expansion look legal. Treaties gave conquest the appearance of consent. Throughout the 1820s, federal officials pressed native nations in the Southeast to cede land, accept boundaries, and consider removal west of the Mississippi. Some leaders signed under pressure. Some believed limited concessions might preserve what remained. Some were bribed, isolated, or threatened. Some refused and were bypassed. In Creek country, the pressure became explosive. The Treaty of Indian Springs in 1825 became one of the most infamous examples. William McIntosh, a prominent Creek leader with ties to U.S. officials and land interests, signed away vast Creek lands in Georgia. Many Creeks viewed the treaty as illegitimate and a betrayal of national law. McIntosh had violated Creek rules against unauthorized land sales. He was executed by Creek opponents. The crisis showed how U.S. treaty policy could tear native nations apart. American officials often treated a signature as enough, even when the signer lacked the authority to sell a people's homeland. Internal divisions became useful to expansion. A contested agreement could become a weapon. President John Quincy Adams rejected the worst parts of the Indian Springs fraud and negotiated a replacement. But Georgia's hunger did not disappear. State leaders wanted native land now, not after careful federal process. The conflict between Georgia and Washington previewed the larger constitutional crisis that would erupt under Jackson. For native nations, the lesson was grim. Refusing to sell brought pressure. Selling brought loss. Dividing over strategy brought accusations of betrayal. Accepting civilization policy did not secure protection. Appealing to federal law worked only if federal leaders were willing to enforce it. Meanwhile, removal advocates framed the West as a solution. Native nations, they said, could move beyond state pressure and live under federal protection. The promise sounded humane when spoken by officials, but it asked entire peoples to abandon homelands, graves, farms, towns, rivers, and political identity so that white settlement could proceed. In Florida, a similar logic developed. Seminoles were pushed onto reservations by the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. The agreement confined them to a central Florida reservation with poor land, limited supplies, and pressure from nearby settlers. It also exposed the unresolved question of black Seminoles and fugitive slaves. Every treaty claimed to settle the problem. Every treaty created the next crisis. The Cherokee Nation became the most visible test of whether law could protect native sovereignty. Cherokee leaders had spent years building institutions that U.S. officials claimed to admire. They adopted a written constitution in 1827. They operated courts and schools. Sequoyah's syllabary made Cherokee literacy a powerful force. The Cherokee Phoenix carried political argument across distances. Leaders such as John Ross used diplomacy, petitions, and law to defend the nation. Then gold was discovered in Georgia in 1828. The pressure sharpened instantly. Georgia extended state law over Cherokee territory, divided Cherokee lands by lottery, and moved to crush Cherokee political authority. The state treated Cherokee sovereignty as an obstacle to be dissolved. The federal government faced a direct question. Would it defend treaty obligations, or would it allow a state to destroy a native nation inside its claimed borders? The Cherokee fought in court. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, the Supreme Court did not grant the full relief the Cherokee sought, but Chief Justice John Marshall described native nations as domestic dependent nations. The phrase captured both recognition and confinement. It acknowledged political existence while placing native nations under the shadow of U.S. power. In Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the court went further. It held that Georgia laws had no force inside Cherokee territory and that relations with native nations belonged to the federal government, not the states. On paper, this was a major Cherokee victory. In practice, it exposed the weakness of law without enforcement. President Andrew Jackson did not use federal power to protect Cherokee sovereignty against Georgia. Whether or not the famous quotation often attributed to him is exact, the reality was clear. The court's decision did not stop Georgia. The machinery of removal kept moving. The Cherokee story mattered for every native nation in the Southeast. If the Cherokee, with written laws, courts, diplomacy, Christianity, newspapers, and a Supreme Court victory, could not secure protection, then who could? In Florida, Seminole leaders watched the same federal government press them toward removal. The lesson was not subtle. Law might speak. Power decided whether anyone listened. Andrew Jackson entered the presidency in 1829 as the most famous military hero in the United States. To supporters, he represented democratic energy, frontier strength, and resistance to elite control. To native nations, his rise carried a different meaning. Jackson had fought Creeks, invaded Florida, seized Spanish posts, and built his reputation on the southern frontier. He saw native sovereignty east of the Mississippi as incompatible with American expansion. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The law authorized the president to negotiate removal treaties, exchanging native lands in the east for lands west of the Mississippi. Its supporters described removal as voluntary, protective, even benevolent. They claimed native nations could escape state pressure by moving west. But the word voluntary hid the reality. Native nations were being pressured by state laws, settler violence, debt, fraud, military threat, and federal policy. Refusing removal did not mean being left alone. It meant enduring a tightening ring of coercion. Debate over the law was fierce. Opponents warned that removal violated treaties, honor, religion, and justice. Supporters answered with expansionist certainty. The vote was close, but Jackson won. The act did not remove anyone by itself. It created the framework. The work would be done through treaties, pressure campaigns, factional divisions, and, when necessary, force. The Choctaw were the first of the southeastern nations forced into large-scale removal under the new policy. Their removal in the early 1830s became a human disaster of exposure, hunger, disease, and loss. The Creek, Chickasaw, and Cherokee faced their own versions of pressure and removal. Each nation had its own politics and timeline, but the direction was clear. Florida's Seminoles were smaller in number than the Cherokee or Choctaw, but their position was uniquely difficult for the United States. The peninsula's terrain favored resistance. The presence of black Seminoles complicated every negotiation. Slaveholders demanded the return of fugitives. Seminole leaders feared that removal west would expose black allies to enslavement and destroy the autonomy they had built in Florida. Jackson's policy aimed to settle the native question east of the Mississippi. Instead, in Florida, it helped ignite the longest and most expensive Indian War in U.S. history. The Indian Removal Act did not remain theory for long. The first great test came with the Choctaw. Under the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830, Choctaw leaders ceded their remaining homelands east of the Mississippi and accepted removal west. Some leaders believed they were choosing the least destructive option available. They faced Mississippi's pressure, federal determination, and the reality that refusal might bring even worse terms. The removal that followed revealed what federal promises meant on the ground. Thousands of Choctaw people moved west through cold, mud, hunger, disease, and disorganization. Supplies failed, contractors profited, families were separated, old people, children, and the sick suffered terribly. Newspapers sometimes described the removal as tragic, but tragedy did not stop policy. To officials committed to removal, suffering became a problem of management rather than a reason to reverse course. The Creek faced their own tightening circle. Alabama settlers poured into Creek lands even before federal promises were fulfilled. Fraud, debt, violence, and illegal occupation created chaos. Creek leaders tried to navigate a world in which every concession invited another demand. When some Creeks resisted dispossession, the United States treated resistance as disorder. Removal became more coercive, not less. The Cherokee continued to fight through law and diplomacy, but Georgia kept pressing. The Chickasaw negotiated removal with more control over some financial terms, yet still faced the same basic reality. The eastern homeland was being made impossible to keep. These removals mattered in Florida because Seminoles saw the pattern. Officials promised protection in the West. Native people saw hunger, fraud, coercion, and broken assurances. Officials described removal as peaceful. Native people saw soldiers, settlers, state laws, and pressure. Officials claimed treaties represented consent. Native people saw signatures extracted from divided councils and then enforced against entire nations. Seminole resistance did not develop in ignorance. It developed with evidence. Black Seminoles had even more reason to fear the Western promise. If Choctaw and Creek removal could become chaotic and predatory, what would happen to black allies claimed by slaveholders? If the Seminoles were moved near Creeks who had claims against them, who would protect black families? If federal agents could not prevent suffering during removal, why trust them to prevent enslavement after it? By the mid-1830s, the Southeast had become a region of moving boundaries and broken faith. Roads filled with displaced families, survey lines cut into old homelands, military posts expanded, state governments pressed for jurisdiction, slaveholders demanded fugitives. Federal officials insisted that removal was inevitable. Florida was not isolated from this wider removal world. It was where that world met a people determined to make inevitability fail. The Seminoles had already been pushed once. The Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823 confined them to a reservation in central Florida. The land was often poor, supplies were unreliable, hunting and farming were difficult. Settlers pressed from outside. U.S. officials watched movement, demanded compliance, and continued to raise the issue of alleged fugitive slaves. For Seminole families, the reservation system felt less like protection than containment. Florida itself made containment hard. The peninsula was a world of wetlands, rivers, hammocks, pine flatwoods, prairies, and hidden paths. Seminole and Black Seminole communities knew how to move through it. American soldiers and officials often did not. That geography gave resistance a future. The Black Seminole issue made removal especially dangerous. Many Black Seminoles had relationships with Seminole towns that did not fit U.S. slave law. Some paid tribute, some fought as allies, some lived in separate settlements with their own leaders. To Southern slaveholders, this did not matter. They saw Black autonomy as theft and rebellion. They wanted people returned as property. If the Seminoles moved west, what would happen to their Black allies? That question haunted every negotiation. U.S. officials often insisted that only people legally claimed as slaves would be returned. Seminoles and Black Seminoles had reasons not to trust those assurances. Removal west would bring them closer to Creek enemies and slave-catching power. It might fracture alliances, expose families, and place Black Seminoles under new danger. White settlers in Florida also pushed aggressively. They wanted security, land, and roads. They accused Seminoles of theft or violence. Seminoles accused settlers of intrusion, abuse, and bad faith. Each incident became part of a growing crisis. By the early 1830s, federal officials wanted a new treaty that would move the Seminoles out of Florida altogether. That treaty would be Payne's Landing. In 1832, a group of Seminole leaders met U.S. officials at Payne's Landing on the Ocklawaha River. The treaty that emerged became the center of the coming war. It said the Seminoles would send a delegation west to inspect lands assigned near the creeks. If the delegation found the land suitable, the Seminoles would remove. The language and process were disputed. U.S. officials treated the agreement as binding. Many Seminoles argued that it was conditional, misunderstood, coerced, or signed by leaders without authority to commit everyone. A delegation did travel west. At Fort Gibson in 1833, U.S. officials pushed the delegates to approve the western land. Again, the meaning of consent became contested. American authorities claimed the Seminoles had agreed. Many Seminoles in Florida rejected that claim. The problem was not only land, it was identity and survival. Moving west meant living near the Creeks, some of whom regarded Seminoles as breakaways and had claims against black Seminoles. It meant leaving Florida's protective terrain. It meant trusting federal promises that had already failed across the Southeast. It meant accepting that the United States could define Seminole consent even when many Seminoles denied giving it. Pressure mounted. U.S. agents demanded preparation for removal. Seminole leaders stalled, debated, and resisted. Some considered accommodation, others rejected removal outright. Micanopy, the principal chief, moved cautiously. Osceola, younger and more militant, emerged as one of the most famous voices of defiance. Osceola was not a hereditary head chief, but leadership in crisis does not always follow formal rank. He understood the emotional power of refusal. He spoke to anger that many felt, but not all could safely express. He became a symbol because he dramatized the choice in front of the Seminoles: submit to removal or fight for Florida. U.S. officials increasingly saw resistance as defiance that had to be broken. Seminoles increasingly saw removal as a threat that could not be survived. The treaty machine had produced another paper victory. This time, paper would not be enough. Osceola's legend grew from moments of confrontation. The most famous story places him before Indian agent Wiley Thompson at Fort King, angrily rejecting the removal treaty and driving a knife through the paper. Like many famous frontier scenes, the details have been retold in different forms. But the meaning endured because it captured a real political truth. Osceola refused to let U.S. officials define consent for the Seminoles. Thompson represented the removal policy in Florida. He insisted that the treaty was valid and that removal would proceed. He also controlled annuities and supplies, giving him leverage over Seminole communities already under pressure. Osceola challenged not only a document, but the entire system of coercion around it. The conflict became personal and political. Osceola was arrested at one point and later released after appearing to promise compliance. Whether he meant it, or whether he used the moment to regain freedom, the result was the same. His resistance intensified. Around him, Seminole and Black Seminole networks prepared. Families moved deeper into defensible country. Warriors gathered supplies. Messages traveled through towns and hammocks. Leaders debated timing. Some Seminoles still hoped to avoid full war, but the deadline for removal approached and trust collapsed. Black Seminoles had urgent reasons to resist. Removal could mean enslavement or the loss of hard-won autonomy. Their knowledge of terrain, languages, farming, and warfare made them essential allies. U.S. officials often underestimated how central they were to Seminole resistance. The Florida crisis was not simply a matter of one charismatic warrior. It was a coalition of people who understood that removal threatened everything: land, kinship, political independence, and freedom. By late 1835, the situation was ready to explode. Two targets came into focus. One was Wiley Thompson at Fort King. The other was a column of U.S. soldiers marching under Major Francis Dade. In December 1835, U.S. forces in Florida were scattered, anxious, and underprepared for the scale of resistance forming around them. Major Francis Dade led a column north from Fort Brooke, near present-day Tampa, toward Fort King. His men marched through pine woods, palmetto, and open stretches that seemed quiet but were being watched. The army believed it was moving through dangerous country, but it did not fully grasp the coordination against it. Seminole fighters chose the ground carefully. On December 28, 1835, they attacked Dade's column. The first volley killed Dade and many of his men. The battle became a devastating defeat for the U.S. Army. Almost the entire command was killed. The event shocked the United States and became known as Dade's Battle, or the Dade Massacre in American memory. That same day, Osceola and a small party killed Wiley Thompson near Fort King. The timing made the message unmistakable. Removal would not proceed as an administrative process. It had become war. For Americans, the attacks seemed sudden and horrifying. For Seminoles and Black Seminoles, they came after years of pressure, contested treaties, threats to freedom, and demands to abandon Florida. The opening blows were violent, but they were not without context. News spread quickly, panic moved through settlements, militia mobilized, federal officials called for troops, newspapers framed the conflict through outrage and fear. Many Americans expected a swift campaign of punishment. They were wrong. Florida would not behave like a conventional battlefield. Roads were few. Wetlands swallowed movement. Heat, disease, insects, and supply problems weakened armies. Seminole fighters used mobility, concealment, and local knowledge. Black Seminole allies helped sustain resistance. Families moved through landscapes that frustrated large columns. The United States had entered a war it did not understand. After Dade's defeat and Thompson's death, American commanders rushed to regain control. General Duncan Clinch moved against Seminole forces near the Withlacoochee River at the end of 1835. The river and surrounding terrain favored defenders who understood the crossings. Seminole fighters under leaders including Osceola and Micanopy used the landscape to blunt American movement. The fighting at the Withlacoochee showed what kind of war this would be. U.S. troops could win ground for a moment, but holding control was another matter. Seminole forces did not need to defend fixed cities. They needed to survive, strike, disappear, and keep their families beyond the reach of removal. The war was not about a single capital or fort. It was about a whole landscape. American commanders faced a frustrating enemy. Seminole forces avoided the kind of decisive battle that U.S. officers wanted. When pressured, they withdrew into swamps and hammocks. When overlooked, they struck roads, settlements, or detachments. Every march required supplies. Every supply line required protection. Every protected road created another target. Florida itself became a combatant. Soldiers from the north and west entered heat and wetlands they had never known. Uniforms rotted, shoes failed, sickness spread, horses struggled, maps misled. A campaign that looked manageable in Washington became exhausting on the ground. The Seminoles also paid a price. Families had to move constantly. Crops and cattle were vulnerable. Towns could be burned. Hunger and displacement followed resistance. But the opening months proved that removal would not be cheap, fast, or simple. The Second Seminole War had begun as a refusal to leave. It would become a grinding contest over whether the United States could force a people out of one of the most difficult landscapes in North America. By early 1836, the United States faced a sobering truth. The Seminoles had not collapsed. Dade's column was destroyed. Thompson was dead. Clinch had fought at the Withlacoochee without ending resistance. Settlers were frightened. Florida's territorial government demanded protection. Washington faced embarrassment. Andrew Jackson, now nearing the end of his presidency, saw one of his central policies challenged by a smaller native nation that refused to disappear. The war also exposed the limits of removal logic. Officials had insisted that removal was orderly, legal, and inevitable. Florida showed what happened when a people rejected that inevitability. Treaties could be disputed. Deadlines could be ignored. Roads could be ambushed. Forts could be isolated. A policy designed in offices could dissolve in swamp water. Black Seminoles made the challenge even sharper. Their resistance reminded slaveholders that the war was not only about native land, it was also about black freedom. Every black Seminole fighter, interpreter, farmer, or scout contradicted the claim that slavery's power was natural and secure. The United States would send more troops. It would spend more money. It would cycle through commanders, strategies, promises, and betrayals. The war would continue for years, becoming the longest and costliest Indian war in U.S. history. It would include negotiations under flags of truce, captures, forced removals, plantation fears, military frustration, and acts of extraordinary endurance by Seminole and Black Seminole communities. But Episode 4 ends at the beginning because the beginning reveals the central truth. Removal was not simply a law passed in 1830. It was a struggle fought town by town, river by river, family by family. The War of 1812 had helped create the conditions for this moment. It weakened British influence, broke Tecumseh's coalition, devastated the Creek world, elevated Andrew Jackson, and helped push Spain out of Florida. The First Seminole War showed that U.S. power would cross borders in the name of security. The Indian Removal Act gave that power a national policy. Payne's Landing tried to turn policy into paperwork. Osceola and the Seminoles turned the paperwork into war. The story from New Orleans to the Withlacoochee is therefore not a side road. It is the road. It shows how a patriotic war against Britain became a continental struggle over who would control land, law, labor, and refuge. It shows how national heroes could become agents of dispossession. It shows how native nations used diplomacy, adaptation, law, and armed resistance when every other path narrowed. For the Seminoles and Black Seminoles, Florida was not a bargaining chip. It was home, refuge, and survival. The next episode will follow the Second Seminole War deeper into its hardest years. The failed campaigns, the capture of Osceola under a flag of truce, the long resistance in the Everglades, and the painful truth that even overwhelming U.S. power could not fully erase Seminole presence in Florida. Episode 4 ends with smoke rising over a peninsula the United States thought it had already acquired. The map said Florida was American. The war proved that maps can lie. The United States expected punishment to restore control. Instead, the war widened. In 1836, Florida became a theater of alarms, patrols, burned settlements, guarded roads, sudden attacks, and failed marches. Columns moved from fort to fort, while Seminole and Black Seminole fighters refused to stand still long enough for a conventional victory. The U.S. Army could occupy a road, a crossing, or a burned town. It could not occupy every hammock, swamp, river bend, and hidden settlement. General Winfield Scott arrived with a plan to crush resistance through coordinated columns. On paper, the strategy looked powerful. In Florida, it broke against distance, heat, rain, bad maps, weak communication, and an opponent who did not fight according to Scott's timetable. When columns converged, Seminoles had often already moved. When troops searched one district, families and fighters slipped into another. The war also became a political embarrassment. Newspapers demanded action, settlers demanded protection. Officers blamed terrain, supplies, militia discipline, and each other. Washington kept discovering that sending more men did not automatically create control. Seminole resistance was not effortless. Crops were destroyed, cattle were seized. Families were forced to move repeatedly. Hunger and exhaustion grew, but survival itself became strategy. If the United States could not force removal quickly, then every month of resistance proved that the Treaty of Payne's Landing had not settled Florida. For Black Seminoles, the stakes remained immediate and personal. Some fought, some scouted, some translated, some protected families and food stores. Their presence kept the conflict tied to slavery as well as land. U.S. officers wanted military victory. Southern slaveholders wanted people captured and returned. Seminole leaders wanted a future in which their allies were not abandoned. The war's center was therefore not only the battlefield. It was the question of whether freedom communities could survive inside an expanding slaveholding republic. While Florida burned, removal continued across the Southeast. In Alabama and Georgia, the Creek crisis worsened in 1836. The Treaty of Coacoochee had broken Creek land into individual allotments. But the promise of orderly transition collapsed under fraud, debt, settler violence, and illegal occupation. Many Creek families found themselves dispossessed before removal even formally began. When some resisted, American authorities treated the crisis as rebellion. Federal and state power moved together. Militia, soldiers, speculators, and officials forced the issue. Thousands of Creeks were marched west under military guard. Families left fields, towns, and burial grounds under conditions shaped by coercion and fear. The removal was not a clean administrative transfer, it was a human rupture. The Cherokee Nation faced the next tightening ring. A small faction signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding Cherokee lands and agreeing to removal. Most Cherokee people and the principal leadership under John Ross rejected the treaty as illegitimate. They petitioned, protested, and insisted that a minority faction had no right to sell the nation. The United States treated the treaty as binding. This repeated the old pattern with devastating force. A contested signature became a national policy. A divided council became a weapon. The same federal government that had heard Cherokee legal arguments now prepared to enforce Cherokee dispossession. Florida Seminoles understood this pattern. The Treaty of Payne's Landing had also been disputed. The United States had also treated contested consent as final. Across the Southeast, removal policy did not wait for genuine agreement. It searched for enough paper to justify power. By 1837, the war in Florida and the pressure on the Cherokee were not separate episodes. They were different fronts in the same transformation. The United States remaking the Southeast for settlement, slavery, and state authority. As the war dragged on, American commanders increasingly turned to negotiation, deception, and removal by capture. General Thomas Jessup became one of the central figures in this phase. He understood that chasing Seminole fighters through Florida could continue indefinitely, so he used talks, promises, pressure on food supplies, and the seizure of leaders to break resistance networks. In 1837, Osceola came in under a flag of truce near St. Augustine. He was seized. To many Americans, Osceola had become the face of the war. Dramatic, defiant, impossible to ignore. To Seminoles and allies, his capture under truce confirmed what they already feared about U.S. promises. If a white flag could become a trap, then negotiation itself became dangerous. Osceola was imprisoned first at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, and later moved to Fort Moultrie near Charleston. He died there in early 1838, far from the Florida homelands he had refused to leave. His death did not end the war. That was the lesson American commanders struggled to absorb. Osceola mattered deeply, but Seminole resistance was larger than one man. Micanopy, Coacoochee, Abiaka, Alligator, Jumper, Halleck Tustanuggy, and many others remained part of the conflict's continuing life. Black Seminole leaders and communities also kept shaping strategy and survival. The seizure of leaders produced removals. It also produced bitterness and renewed distrust. Every captured chief, every broken promise, every forced march made clear that the United States was willing to treat diplomacy as another weapon. The war had entered a harsher phase, not a quick victory, a campaign of attrition. In December 1837, Colonel Zachary Taylor led U.S. troops into South Florida. Taylor's column moved through difficult country toward Lake Okeechobee, searching for Seminole forces and hoping to deliver the kind of blow that earlier campaigns had failed to achieve. The march itself showed the Army's problem. The farther troops moved into Florida, the more the landscape stripped away confidence. Mud, water, sawgrass, heat, and confusion turned movement into labor. On Christmas Day, Taylor's force met Seminole fighters near Lake Okeechobee. The fighting was fierce. Seminole warriors used the terrain well, firing from cover behind sawgrass and trees. U.S. troops pushed forward at heavy cost. Taylor claimed victory because his force held the field. But the battle did not destroy Seminole resistance. Many fighters withdrew. The war continued. Okeechobee made Taylor famous. It helped carry him toward national prominence and eventually the presidency. But as a military solution, it revealed the same contradiction that had defined the war from the beginning. The United States could win a battle and still fail to end the conflict. For Seminoles and Black Seminoles, withdrawal was not the same as defeat. Survival remained the strategic core. If families, leaders, and fighters could continue beyond the battlefield, then removal remained incomplete. The battle also showed how costly Florida had become. Men died or fell wounded in a war many Americans had expected to be small. Money poured into forts, roads, expeditions, and supply lines. The campaign consumed attention without delivering closure. Okeechobee gave the United States a hero. It did not give the United States Florida on its own terms. While the Seminole War continued, the Cherokee removal reached its darkest moment. In 1838, federal troops under General Winfield Scott moved into Cherokee country to enforce the Treaty of New Echota. Cherokee families were rounded up into camps. Homes were abandoned. Farms and possessions were left behind or taken by others. The nation that had fought through law, diplomacy, newspapers, petitions, and constitutional government was forced west. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands suffered from hunger, exposure, disease, grief, and exhaustion. Many died. The removal was not one single road, but a network of detachments, routes, camps, delays, river crossings, and terrible choices. It tore a people from homeland while proving that legal argument and adaptation had not protected them from federal force. The Cherokee removal echoed through the entire Indian removal era. It showed that even the most visible legal resistance could be overridden. It showed how a contested treaty could become the instrument of national policy. It showed how the language of civilization and protection could coexist with soldiers at doorways and families in stockades. In Florida, Seminoles had already feared this future. Now it was happening elsewhere in full view. The Trail of Tears also revealed the moral cost of the War of 1812's aftermath. The republic that celebrated independence and expansion used its growing power to uproot nations inside its borders. The same era that produced national heroes also produced national wounds. The War of 1812 had ended in 1815, but the struggle over the continent had not ended at all. After Osceola's capture and death, resistance continued under other leaders. Coacoochee, also known as Wildcat, became one of the most remarkable figures of the later war. Captured at one point and imprisoned at Fort Marion, he escaped with others in a daring flight that became part of Seminole memory. His resistance showed again that the war could not be reduced to one famous leader or one dramatic moment. Abiaka, often called Sam Jones by Americans, also remained important. Older, elusive, and deeply rooted in the southern Florida world, he symbolized the refusal to submit even after years of pressure. U.S. officers found it difficult to force decisive terms on people who could retreat into landscapes the army barely understood. The Everglades and Big Cypress country became central to the war's later phase. These were not empty hiding places. They were lived landscapes of water, islands, tree hammocks, trails, food knowledge, and seasonal movement. Seminole and Black Seminole communities used them to survive military pressure. American strategy became harsher. Troops built roads and forts, destroyed crops, seized cattle, captured families, and tried to starve resistance into surrender. Some commanders used negotiation, others used pursuit. Some even experimented with bloodhounds imported from Cuba, a choice that horrified critics and revealed how desperate the war had become. Removals continued in pieces. Captured leaders and families were sent west. Some Black Seminoles were separated, claimed, negotiated over, or removed under uncertain protections. The question of freedom followed them beyond Florida, yet a core Seminole presence remained. The United States could reduce resistance. It could not erase it. By 1842, the United States had spent years, lives, and enormous sums trying to force the Seminoles from Florida. Many had been removed west. Many had died. Communities had been shattered. The war left deep scars across Florida and across the native South. But the United States did not achieve complete removal. A smaller Seminole population remained in Florida, especially in the southern wetlands. That fact mattered. The Second Seminole War ended less like a triumphant conquest than an exhausted decision to stop. Officials declared the main war over, reduced military operations, and accepted what they had once denied. Some Seminoles would remain. The map had changed, the population had changed, the power balance had changed, but Seminole survival in Florida endured. The larger Indian removal era continued to shape the West. Native nations removed from the Southeast rebuilt under painful conditions. Political struggles followed them. Slavery followed some communities west. Old divisions deepened. New towns, governments, farms, and conflicts emerged from displacement. For the United States, removal opened millions of acres to cotton, settlement, speculation, and slavery. It also left a legacy of broken treaties and forced migration that would never be morally settled by legal paperwork. The War of 1812 series has traveled from impressment and Tecumseh to Detroit and New Orleans, to Horseshoe Bend, to Florida, to removal, to the Everglades. The through line is power. Who could claim land? Who could make law? Whose freedom counted? Whose treaties would be honored? Whose homes could be renamed frontier? Episode 4 now ends where the era itself refuses a clean ending. With families gone west, families still hidden in Florida, and a republic larger than before, but burdened by what expansion had required. The United States called it removal. The people forced to live it remembered roads, rivers, graves, hunger, smoke, resistance, and survival. In 1842, the United States declared the Second Seminole War over. The declaration sounded final. It suggested that a costly campaign had reached its conclusion, that Washington could close the books, reduce expenses, and move on. But in Florida, the word peace did not mean what officials wanted it to mean. It did not mean the Seminoles were gone. It did not mean the wetlands had been mastered. It did not mean the long struggle that began in the War of 1812's southern borderlands had finally ended. It meant the United States was tired. Many Seminoles had been removed west. Many had died. Families had been shattered by battle, hunger, disease, capture, negotiation, betrayal, and forced migration. Black Seminole communities had been pulled into disputes over freedom, slavery, military service, and removal. The war had consumed money and lives far beyond what American leaders expected. Yet a smaller Seminole population remained in Florida. That survival mattered. It turned the official ending into an uneasy compromise. The United States had not achieved complete removal. It had forced many people out, but it had not erased Seminole presence from the peninsula. In the Everglades, Big Cypress, and the remote southern interior, families continued to live beyond the clean lines of federal maps. Episode 5 begins in that uneasy silence after 1842. It follows the years when the government tried to turn exhaustion into policy, when remaining Seminoles tried to preserve distance and dignity, and when the pressure for land slowly rebuilt toward another war. The War of 1812 had ended decades earlier, but its consequences still moved through Florida water. The Seminoles who remained in Florida did not survive by accident. They survived through knowledge, movement, caution, and community. The wetlands were not empty hiding places. They were homelands of water, islands, hammocks, trails, animals, plants, seasonal roots, and memory. Outsiders often saw only swamp and confusion. Seminole families saw a living geography that could feed them, shelter them, and warn them. Leaders such as Abiaka, remembered by many Americans as Sam Jones, embodied this endurance. Older, elusive, and rooted in the southern country, he represented a form of resistance that did not depend on winning formal battles. Avoiding capture, maintaining community, and refusing removal could be forms of victory when the enemy's goal was disappearance. Other leaders, including Billy Bowlegs, would become central in the next phase. Bowlegs had survived the earlier war and understood the danger of open confrontation. The balance was delicate. Too much contact invited pressure. Too much isolation made trade and diplomacy difficult. Every meeting with American officials carried the shadow of earlier broken promises. For Seminole families, the years after 1842 were not peaceful in the ordinary sense. They were watchful. Soldiers remained in Florida. Settlers kept arriving. Surveyors and speculators looked at land that had once been dismissed as useless and began imagining profit. Each new road, fort, and claim narrowed the space in which Seminole autonomy could breathe. The United States wanted certainty. The Seminoles wanted room. Those two desires could not easily coexist. Far from Florida, removed Seminoles and other southeastern native peoples faced another struggle: rebuilding after forced migration. Indian Territory was not a blank refuge waiting peacefully beyond the Mississippi. It was a place where removed nations had to reconstruct governments, farms, towns, families, alliances, and political authority under painful conditions. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole peoples each carried different experiences of removal, factional conflict, and loss. Old divisions traveled west with them. For Seminoles removed from Florida, the western future was especially complicated. They entered a region shaped by Creek political influence, federal supervision, and the unresolved status of Black Seminoles. Some Black Seminoles had fought beside Seminoles in Florida. Some had been removed west under promises or understandings that did not always protect them. Slaveholders continued to press claims. Freedom remained contested even after exile. The map made removal look simple. People moved from east to west. The human reality was not simple. Removal broke old places, but did not automatically create stable new ones. Families searched for relatives. Leaders negotiated with federal agents. Communities tried to plant crops and rebuild houses, while memories of Florida remained raw. Some people adapted with extraordinary resilience. Others found the Western settlement another landscape of pressure. This Western story belongs inside the finale because the Indian Wars were never only about battlefields. They were also about what happened afterward, the struggle to remain a people after the government had tried to move the people somewhere else. Removal was not the end of history. It was another beginning forced by power. No part of this story can be understood without Black Seminoles. From the era of Spanish Florida through the Seminole Wars, Black Seminole communities had stood at the dangerous meeting point of native sovereignty and Black freedom. Some were descendants of people who escaped slavery. Some lived in alliance with Seminole towns. Some paid tribute. Some fought, farmed, scouted, translated, negotiated, and protected families. Their existence challenged the slaveholding South's belief that no Black community could remain armed, mobile, and allied beyond plantation control. After removal, the danger did not vanish. In the West, Black Seminoles faced renewed claims from slaveholders and political pressure from officials who did not always treat freedom as settled. Some eventually moved again, including groups who crossed toward Mexico, where the politics of slavery and freedom took a different shape. Others served as scouts in later border conflicts, carrying skills forged in Florida into new landscapes of danger. This was one of the cruel patterns of the era. A people could survive one displacement and still face another. They could win moments of freedom and still have that freedom questioned by men with documents, debts, guns, or political influence. Black Seminole history therefore widens the meaning of the War of 1812's aftermath. The United States did not simply expand across land, it expanded a system of control. In Florida, that system targeted native autonomy and Black refuge together. In the West, the same questions followed. Who could be free, who could claim protection, and whose testimony would the law believe? The final episode has to hold that truth clearly. Survival was not only Seminole survival in Florida, it was also Black Seminole survival across borders. During the 1840s, Florida changed around the people who remained. Statehood came in 1845. That mattered because statehood increased pressure for land, roads, plantations, security, and political control. Florida was no longer a distant territory at the edge of the Republic. It was a state whose white citizens expected the federal government to remove what they saw as obstacles to settlement. Officials in Washington still preferred removal. The smaller Seminole population left in Florida was tolerated only because the previous war had become so expensive and difficult. But toleration is not the same as respect. Federal policy continued to assume that native presence in Florida was temporary. Seminole leaders understood the danger. They knew that peace depended on distance and that distance was shrinking. Traders, soldiers, surveyors, and settlers carried news, goods, rumors, and threats. A single misunderstanding could become a crisis. A single violent encounter could become an argument for renewed removal. The United States often framed the issue as security. Settlers wanted assurance that farms and roads would be safe. Officials wanted stable jurisdiction. But from the Seminole perspective, security meant something different. Protection from removal, protection from fraud, protection from military pressure, and protection from the slow invasion of everyday life. These competing definitions of security made another conflict increasingly possible. The frontier looked quiet. Underneath, it was tightening. Billy Bowlegs became the most visible Seminole leader in the years after the Second Seminole War. To Americans, he was often treated as the man whose choices might decide whether Florida remained peaceful. To Seminoles, his position was more complex. Leadership meant guarding people who had survived decades of war. It meant weighing negotiation against suspicion, trade against exposure, and patience against the risk that patience would be mistaken for weakness. Bowlegs did not seek a grand war in the way American newspapers sometimes imagined native leaders as naturally warlike. He lived in a world where US power surrounded his people. War could bring devastation, but submission could bring removal. Between those dangers, a leader had to move carefully. The US Army also watched him carefully. Officers wanted to prevent violence, but also wanted final removal. Federal agents tried persuasion, gifts, pressure, and negotiation. Sometimes they promised that remaining Seminoles could stay if they remained peaceful. At other times, officials treated their presence as a problem that still required a final answer. That inconsistency was itself destabilizing. When a government speaks peace while preparing coercion, every promise becomes suspect. Bowlegs inherited not only land and leadership, he inherited memory. Payne's landing, Osceola's capture, Okeechobee, removals, camps, hunger, and the knowledge that official assurances could become traps. The Third Seminole War did not begin with a grand invasion. It grew from pressure, land hunger, and the physical marking of space. In 1855, a U.S. surveying party moved into Seminole territory in southwest Florida. The work of surveyors can look harmless on paper: lines, notes, stakes, measurements, charts. But in the history of expansion, survey lines often came before roads, claims, sales, and settlement. To the people already living there, a survey could look like the first step toward dispossession. The crisis sharpened when members of the surveying party damaged property associated with Billy Bowlegs, including banana plants. To outsiders, the detail could sound small. In context, it was not small. It symbolized intrusion into a space that remaining Seminoles had preserved through decades of struggle. Bowlegs and his followers struck back. The attack in December 1855 opened what became known as the Third Seminole War. Once again, Florida became a military theater. Once again, U.S. troops entered country they did not fully understand. Once again, the goal was removal. And once again, Seminole fighters used mobility, landscape, and survival knowledge against a stronger conventional power. The war began with damaged plants and survey lines, but underneath stood 40 years of memory. The Third Seminole War was smaller than the Second, but it carried the same unresolved question. Could the United States force the last major Seminole communities out of Florida? U.S. forces built posts, launched patrols, burned settlements, destroyed crops, seized supplies, and tried to make continued resistance impossible. Soldiers marched through heat, water, insects, disease, and frustration. The landscape still resisted easy occupation. The old lesson remained. Controlling a fort was not the same as controlling the Everglades. Seminole fighters avoided battles that favored the army. They struck when useful, moved when necessary, and protected families as best they could. Their goal was not to conquer the United States. It was to remain. That difference mattered. American commanders often sought decisive action. Seminole strategy often sought endurance. When one side wants a battle and the other side wants survival, war becomes a contest over time, food, movement, and exhaustion. By the 1850s, the United States was stronger than ever. It had won the Mexican-American War, stretched to the Pacific, and added new territories. Yet in southern Florida, a small native community could still deny the government the clean ending it wanted. That was the remarkable fact. Not that the war was large, that it was still happening at all. The Third Seminole War ended through pressure, negotiation, payments, removals, and fatigue. In 1858, Billy Bowlegs and a number of Seminoles agreed to leave Florida for the West. The departure was not a simple surrender scene. It came after years of military pressure and after federal officials used money and negotiation to accomplish what campaigns alone had not fully achieved. Bowlegs' removal marked the end of the last major armed Seminole conflict in Florida. But once again, the word end requires care. Many Seminoles left, yet not all did. A small population remained in Florida, living in the southern wetlands beyond the reach of complete removal. This pattern repeated the deeper truth of the entire series. The United States could win power, seize land, force treaties, build roads, and remove thousands. It could change the map dramatically, but it could not fully control memory, identity, or survival. For the removed, the West brought new challenges. For those who remained, Florida demanded continued caution. For federal officials, the Seminole problem had been reduced but not erased. For the future Seminole people of Florida, endurance became foundation. The war ended as so many Indian wars ended, not with justice, not with mutual understanding, but with exhaustion and imbalance. Still, survival endured. Removed southeastern nations rebuilt in Indian territory under enormous pressure. They created governments, schools, farms, towns, newspapers, laws, and institutions. They also carried trauma, factional divisions, debates over slavery, conflicts with federal agents, and tensions with neighboring peoples. Removal did not freeze native nations in defeat. It forced them into new political worlds where adaptation itself became survival. The Cherokee Nation had to live with the divisions created by the Treaty of New Echota and the Trail of Tears. The Creek Nation faced its own wounds from coercion, civil conflict, and removal. Choctaw and Chickasaw communities rebuilt after earlier forced migration. Seminoles in the West negotiated their relationship with Creek authority and federal power. These stories complicate any simple ending. The United States often spoke as if removal solved a problem. In reality, removal relocated problems and created new ones. The West became a place of rebuilding, but also a place where federal promises could again shift under pressure. The question of slavery also followed. Some removed native nations included slaveholders. Black Seminoles and freed people lived inside legal and political systems that could be unstable and contested. The sectional crisis growing inside the United States did not stop at the boundary of Indian Territory. By the late 1850s, the nation that had fought the War of 1812 was moving toward a different war with itself. The consequences of expansion were coming home. The War of 1812 helped teach the United States how to imagine itself as a continental power. It survived Britain, it celebrated New Orleans, it watched Tecumseh's Confederacy fall, it broke Creek power at Horseshoe Bend. It pressured Spain out of Florida, it turned borderland conflict into arguments for security and expansion. Then, over the next decades, the same pattern repeated across treaties, roads, surveys, removals, and wars. By the 1850s, the United States had reached the Pacific after the Mexican-American War. It had added enormous western territories. It had grown richer and larger. But expansion did not produce harmony. It produced the question that would split the country. Would slavery expand too? The Indian Wars and removal are part of that story because the Cotton South depended on land. Land hunger pushed native nations aside. Slavery made that hunger more aggressive. Political power followed population, plantations, and new states. The struggle over native homelands and the struggle over slavery were not identical, but they were deeply connected in the Southeast. Florida showed the connection clearly. Seminole resistance threatened land expansion, and the slave system's claim that no refuge could exist beyond its reach. Black Seminole freedom made the issue impossible to reduce to maps alone. Expansion promised opportunity to some Americans. To others, it meant soldiers at the door. Nations remember wars in ways that serve the present. The War of 1812 became, for many Americans, a story of national survival and pride. New Orleans became the triumphant ending. Andrew Jackson became a symbol of decisive leadership. The phrase Second War of Independence turned a messy conflict into a cleaner patriotic memory. But this series has followed the story beyond the clean memory. It has followed Tecumseh and the collapse of native resistance in the Old Northwest. It has followed Fort Mims, Horseshoe Bend, and the Creek catastrophe. It has followed Ghent, New Orleans, and the myth that victory solved the war. It has followed Prospect Bluff, Foultown, Jackson in Florida, Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, Osceola, Okeechobee, Coacoochee, Abiaka, Billy Bowlegs, and the people who remained. That longer memory is harder. It does not deny American courage. Soldiers fought bravely, communities endured invasion, leaders made difficult choices, but it refuses to let courage erase consequence. A republic can defend itself and still become an empire to the people in its path. A battlefield victory can be real and still lead to policies that break homes, nations, and promises. History becomes more useful when it becomes less comfortable. The final memory of this series should not be only a flag over a battlefield. It should also be a fire kept alive in the wetlands. The most important fact at the end of this story is simple. Seminole people remained in Florida. After 3 Seminole wars, after removal treaties, after soldiers, forts, patrols, burned crops, destroyed towns, captured leaders, Western exile and political pressure, they remained. Their numbers were smaller, their lives were constrained, The costs had been terrible, but survival itself became a historical verdict against the idea that removal had been complete. Over time, the descendants of those who remained would build new forms of community and political identity. The modern Seminole and Miccosukee presence in Florida belongs to a much longer story of endurance, adaptation, and sovereignty. This episode cannot tell all of that later history, but it can close by recognizing that the 19th century wars did not end with disappearance. For Black Seminole descendants, the story also continued across borders, in Indian Territory, Mexico, Texas, and beyond. Their history reminds us that freedom struggles often move through places that official maps treat as margins. The United States grew larger, but the people it tried to remove did not simply vanish into that growth. They carried memory forward. The War of 1812. Indian Wars series began with sailors impressed at sea, frontier villages under pressure, and a young republic demanding respect from the world's greatest naval power. It ends in Florida's wetlands, Indian Territory, and the uneasy national memory of expansion. That arc is the real story. The War of 1812 was not only a war between the United States and Britain. It was also a turning point in the struggle for the interior of North America. Native nations tried to defend homelands and political futures. Black refuge communities searched for freedom. Settlers demanded land, slaveholders demanded security. Soldiers enforced policy. Diplomats converted violence into treaty language. Each episode has shown a different face of power. Detroit showed American overconfidence. Lake Erie and the Thames showed the collapse of Tecumseh's dream. Horseshoe Bend showed how Civil War, alliance, and U.S. force broke Creek power. New Orleans showed victory becoming myth. Florida showed borderland invasion becoming national policy. Removal showed paperwork becoming exile. The Seminole Wars showed that survival could outlast conquest. By the late 1850s, the United States stood larger, stronger, and more divided than ever. The same expansion that many celebrated had deepened the slavery crisis and left a trail of broken treaties. Soon, the country would turn its violence inward during the Civil War. But before that next story begins, this one closes with a quieter image. Not a surrender table, not a parade, not a map colored by officials far away. A small fire in the Florida wetlands. Families nearby. Water reflecting the dawn. A people still present after the Republic had spent decades trying to make them leave. The United States called the policy removal. The ending proves another word mattered just as much. Survival. By the time Billy Bowlegs left Florida in 1858, the United States was nearing another crisis. The question of slavery had followed nearly every stage of expansion. It had followed cotton into the Southeast. It had followed removal into Indian Territory. It had followed the Mexican cession into Congress. It had followed settlers, soldiers, surveyors, judges, and speculators into every argument over the nation's future. The War of 1812 generation had often imagined expansion as proof of national strength. By the late 1850s, expansion had become a mirror showing the nation's deepest fracture. Every new acre raised questions about labor, race, citizenship, sovereignty, and political power. Would slavery move west? Would free labor define the new territories? Would federal authority protect slaveholders, settlers, native nations, or no one reliably? Indian Territory stood inside that coming storm. Removed native nations had rebuilt governments and communities, but they could not escape the sectional crisis. Some native leaders and citizens owned enslaved people. Other native people opposed slavery or lived in communities where black freedom and kinship made the issue far more complicated than outside politicians understood. Black Seminoles and other people of African descent remained especially vulnerable to shifting law and power. When the Civil War came, Indian Territory would become a battlefield of alliance, division, survival, and betrayal. That later story belongs to another series, but the roots run through this one. The same expansion that removed native nations also intensified the conflict over slavery. The same federal government that promised protection often proved unreliable when power shifted. The Seminole Wars, therefore, do not sit apart from the great national crisis. They are part of the road toward it. Removal tried to turn living nations into administrative problems. It reduced homelands to cession lines, communities to emigration rolls, and grief to expense reports. Officials counted people, wagons, rations, miles, payments, and acres. They wrote letters about order and policy. They treated the language of law as if it could make coercion clean. But removal could not control what people remembered. It could not erase the meaning of rivers, graves, fields, council fires, hunting grounds, towns, and paths. It could not prevent new communities from forming in exile. It could not stop stories from traveling with families. It could not make the children of survivors forget that their ancestors had endured something the government preferred to call policy. In Florida, removal failed in an even more direct way. Seminole people remained on the land itself. They adapted to smaller numbers, harsher conditions, and constant pressure, but they remained. That fact turned survival into a political statement before it ever became a slogan. It proved that even overwhelming power had limits. The United States succeeded in taking vast lands. It succeeded in removing thousands. It succeeded in expanding plantations, states, roads, and markets. Those facts are real, but they are not the whole truth. The whole truth also includes the people who rebuilt in the West, the people who crossed borders searching for freedom, and the people who stayed in Florida when policy said they should not exist there anymore. A final episode has to decide what kind of memory it leaves behind. The easiest memory would be a straight line. The United States fights, expands, removes, and wins. That version is simple, but it is too small for the truth. It leaves out native strategy, black freedom struggles, political division, broken promises, and the strange way defeat and survival can exist in the same story. A better memory is harder. It admits that American soldiers sometimes fought with courage while also serving unjust policies. It admits that native nations were not passive victims, but political communities making choices under terrible pressure. It admits that black Seminoles were not side characters, but central actors in a borderland world where freedom itself was contested. It admits that treaties can be legal documents and moral failures at the same time. This memory also changes how the War of 1812 looks. The war was not only impressment, Canada, Washington burning, and New Orleans. It was also Tecumseh's last effort to build a native confederacy. It was the Creek War. It was the collapse of British support for native homelands. It was the rise of Jackson. It was Florida. It was removal. It was the long pressure that continued after the official war ended. In that sense, the War of 1812 did not simply make the United States feel independent. It helped make the United States more powerful on the continent. And power always leaves evidence in the lives of the people who had to face it. Imagine the final map of this series. In the north, the Great Lakes hold the memory of Detroit, Lake Erie, and the Thames. Tecumseh's dream of a united native barrier has fallen, but the reason he fought remains understandable. Without unity, the pressure of settlement would keep coming. In the south, Horseshoe Bend marks the breaking of Creek power and the rise of Jackson's military reputation. New Orleans marks the victory that Americans turned into national myth. Florida marks the place where that myth became policy, where the defender of the Republic became the invader of a borderland. Farther west, Indian Territory holds the communities forced to rebuild after removal. Some survived by adapting to new political forms. Some carried divisions that removal had deepened. Some fought to protect freedom in a world where law could be used against them. And in southern Florida, the water still reflects the sky. That is where this series ends. Not because the story ended there, but because the image tells the truth better than a proclamation. A small community remains. A cooking fire burns low. A canoe rests near the grass. The soldiers have withdrawn for now. The maps have changed. The wounds remain. But so does life. The War of 1812 began with a republic demanding respect. Its aftermath asks a harder question. What did that republic do with the power it gained? The answer is written across treaties, battlefields, removals, rivers, roads, and remembered names. It is also written in survival,